On the windswept shores of England, an invasion unlike any in history was poised to strike. Hitler's plan to crush a nation in a single, thunderous stroke, Operation Sea Lion, conceived in the ambitious mind of Adolf Hitler after the swift collapse of France in 1940. It was the code name for a German invasion of Britain, an audacious gamble that depended on air supremacy, naval control, and the rapid submission of an island nation determined to stand alone. Hitler's generals, engineers, and strategists pored over maps, tide charts, and logistical calculations, envisioning thousands of troops storming the beaches, armored divisions pressing inland, and the Luftwaffe dominating the skies above. Yet Britain was not idle. Under Winston Churchill's unwavering leadership, the Royal Air Force, Royal Navy, and Home Guard prepared defences, fortifying coastlines, training volunteers, and leveraging technology that would become decisive. The English Channel, with its treacherous tides and unpredictable weather, served as a natural barrier, while radar stations and early warning systems offered Britain a glimpse of the storm approaching. Every convoy of barges, every rehearsal of amphibious assault, and every calculated air raid underscored the perilous tightrope on which the fate of Europe balanced. Sea Lion was more than a plan. It was a vision of conquest, terror, and control, whose failure would preserve a nation and set the stage for the Allies' eventual resurgence. This is the entire story of Operation Sea Lion, its conception, its audacious ambitions, the defences that thwarted it, and the enduring legacy of a war that might have been won before it began. So close your eyes, settle in, and let this tense and gripping history unfold as you drift into sleep. And before we begin, share in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is there, because across oceans and generations, the memory of this perilous chapter is kept alive. In June 1940, the world watched in stunned silence as France collapsed with a speed that few had anticipated. Within just 6 weeks, the German Wehrmacht had overrun what had been considered one of the most formidable armies in Europe. The French surrender was signed in the same railway carriage where the Germans had once admitted their own defeat in 1918, a gesture carefully orchestrated by Hitler to humiliate his enemies. Across Europe, the fall of France shattered illusions of stability and left governments reeling in disbelief. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler stood triumphant, convinced that his vision of a new European order was within grasp. The German public, intoxicated by victory, saw their leader as invincible and their nation as unstoppable. Yet even amidst the celebrations, Hitler's gaze had already shifted westward across the English Channel. Britain, though battered by the evacuation at Dunkirk and the loss of its continental ally, refused to bow. Winston Churchill's defiance, expressed in his immortal speeches, signaled that Britain would continue the fight. For Hitler, this stubborn island now became the last obstacle to securing dominance over Western Europe. The mood in Britain in the summer of 1940 was a curious mix of despair and determination. The army had barely managed to escape from Dunkirk, leaving behind much of its heavy equipment in the sands of northern France. Across towns and villages, the sense of vulnerability was palpable, as invasion seemed not just possible, but imminent. Yet there was also a fierce resolve among ordinary citizens, who braced themselves for the storm they knew was coming. Families practiced air raid drills, painted their windows black, and built makeshift shelters in back gardens. Volunteer groups, such as the Home Guard, prepared to resist, armed with little more than hunting rifles, farm tools, or sheer courage. Churchill's words, broadcast over the radio, gave strength to millions who clung to hope amid the encroaching darkness. The Prime Minister reminded the nation that this was not merely a struggle for Britain's survival, but for the survival of civilization itself. While Londoners queued for rations and sandbags, they carried within them a quiet determination that shocked even Hitler. For Britain, standing alone against the Reich was not a choice but a duty to history. From Hitler's perspective, Britain presented a puzzle he had not anticipated. On one hand, he admired Britain's empire and naval tradition, and privately he believed they might yet seek peace. On the other, Britain's refusal to negotiate after the fall of France baffled and infuriated him. He had expected Churchill's government to fold, as so many continental leaders had done before. Instead, he found himself staring at a nation unwilling to yield, even as German forces controlled virtually all of Western Europe. In his mind, Britain's survival was a mere technical obstacle, one that would be erased by the overwhelming superiority of the Luftwaffe. The Royal Air Force, though courageous, was dismissed by Hitler and Goering as too small to pose a serious challenge. With ports, airfields and resources stretched thin, they believed British resistance would collapse under sustained aerial bombardment. Hitler's generals prepared operational plans for an amphibious invasion, codenamed Selayon, that would cross the Channel once air superiority was secured. The German dictator believed the battle would be swift, decisive and brutal, yet he underestimated the depth of Britain's resolve and the ingenuity of its defenders. Europe, meanwhile, stood in uneasy silence as the drama unfolded. Governments that had fallen under German occupation looked toward Britain as the final beacon of hope. Neutral nations, watching Hitler's aggression with growing unease, speculated about whether the British could possibly withstand such a storm. In the streets of Paris, now under Nazi control, whispers of defiance spread quietly, their eyes fixed on London. Across the Atlantic, Franklin Roosevelt and the American public observed with mounting concern, debating whether the United States should intervene. Soviet leaders, though bound by a temporary pact with Hitler, carefully monitored Britain's resistance, aware that Germany's attention could one day turn eastward. The fall of France had demonstrated the terrifying speed of blitzkrieg, and many assumed Britain's fate would be no different. Propaganda across occupied Europe depicted Hitler as unstoppable, his armies invincible, his strategy flawless. Yet every day that Britain held out, the myth of inevitability began to crack. The continent waited, breath held as the struggle between tyranny and defiance shifted to the skies above the Channel. Inside Germany, the mood of triumph concealed a dangerous overconfidence. Hitler's generals, fresh from victory in France, assumed the Luftwaffe would make quick work of the RAF. Hermann Goering, head of the Luftwaffe, boasted that his pilots would sweep the British Air Force from the sky in a matter of weeks. German propaganda portrayed Britain as an isolated, exhausted nation, ready to collapse with a final push. Hitler himself, still imagining the possibility of peace, issued offers to Britain to negotiate, but Churchill dismissed them as empty threats. The failure of these overtures hardened Hitler's determination to break Britain through force. Preparations for Operation Selayon advanced with urgency, though many German commanders privately doubted the feasibility of a cross-channel invasion. Without air superiority, the risks of such an operation were immense, and even Hitler hesitated to launch it prematurely. Nonetheless, the Luftwaffe was ordered to begin a campaign of destruction aimed at crippling Britain's defences and morale. Factories, ports and airfields were marked as primary targets, paving the way for the next phase of the war. As the summer sun lingered over Europe, the stage was set for a confrontation unlike any in history. For Britain's leaders, the reality was grim, but not hopeless. Intelligence reports warned of invasion preparations, yet the Royal Navy's dominance in the Channel remained a significant deterrent. The RAF, though badly outnumbered, relied on a cutting-edge network of radar stations and a system of rapid response that would soon prove decisive. Churchill placed his faith in the few, those young pilots who would bear the weight of the nation's survival on their shoulders. Factories worked around the clock to produce Spitfires and Hurricanes, aircraft that would soon become legendary. In towns across Britain, communities gathered metal to contribute to the war effort, melting down railings, pots and pans. Air raid wardens drilled civilians relentlessly, preparing them for the nightmare of bombing raids. The sense of collective resistance permeated every aspect of British life, transforming fear into resolve. Britain had no illusions about the trials to come, but the people understood their survival depended on unity. In this crucible, a spirit of defiance was forged, one that Hitler had never truly accounted for. The island was ready to fight back, whatever the cost. As Hitler shifted his gaze across the Channel, he misjudged not only Britain's resolve, but also the shifting tide of global perception. The United States, though officially neutral, grew increasingly sympathetic to Britain's plight. Roosevelt authorized the transfer of arms and supplies, laying the groundwork for what would become Lend-Lease. In occupied Europe, resistance movements gained strength, inspired by Britain's refusal to surrender. The German dictator, blinded by arrogance, saw only a stubborn enemy delaying the inevitable. Yet with each passing day, the balance of global sympathy tilted further against him. Churchill's speeches, broadcast far beyond Britain, framed the conflict as a moral struggle between freedom and tyranny. The longer Britain endured, the more Hitler's image as an invincible conqueror began to falter. In Berlin, his advisors warned that time was not on their side, yet Hitler pressed forward, determined to force Britain into submission. The battle that was coming would not only decide the fate of an island, but also the credibility of the Reich itself. And for the first time, cracks appeared in the vision of total domination. Thus, by the late summer of 1940, Europe stood on the brink of a new phase of war. France lay defeated, its cities under German control, while Britain alone bore the weight of resistance. Hitler's ambitions, sharpened by triumph, now pointed across the Channel with deadly intent. The Luftwaffe prepared its bombers, crews briefed on missions that would bring fire and destruction to British soil. Radar operators, pilots and civilians across Britain braced for the storm that all knew was coming. In Berlin, Hitler anticipated another swift victory that would force Churchill to his knees. In London, Churchill believed this was Britain's finest hour, a moment that would define the character of the nation for generations. The stage was set for the Battle of Britain, a clash that would unfold not on fields or trenches but in the skies. For the first time in history, air power alone would decide the fate of nations. And as Hitler's eyes fixed firmly on Britain, the world prepared to witness a confrontation that would alter the course of the Second World War forever. In the aftermath of France's collapse in June 1940, Adolf Hitler turned his calculating gaze across the English Channel, convinced that Britain's defiance was a temporary obstacle. He believed the island nation stood isolated, stripped of allies and drained of morale after Dunkirk. Yet Winston Churchill's words of resistance echoed loudly, refusing to surrender, and this persistence irritated Hitler deeply. On July 16, 1940, the Führer issued a momentous order known as Directive No. 16, marking the blueprint for the invasion of Britain. This operation, given the codename Sea Lion, was envisioned as a cross-channel assault of unprecedented scale. Hitler demanded meticulous planning, setting the stage for German naval, air and land forces to coordinate an invasion that would dwarf any previous European campaign. In his mind, Britain's survival was only possible through illusion. He underestimated the nation's willpower, but recognized the military risks. The order outlined both the destruction of the Royal Air Force and the seizure of naval dominance as preconditions. It was an ambitious gamble, reflecting Hitler's arrogance as much as his opportunism. The world's eyes turned toward the Channel, where an invasion would decide the future of Western Europe. Directive Nr. 16 was not a mere idea, it was a precise command delivered to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, Germany's military high command. The Führer declared that England must be brought down, and he envisioned it happening swiftly, decisively, and before the year's end. Planning required Germany's army to gather vast numbers of barges, transport ships, and landing craft, many of which did not even exist yet. The Kriegsmarine, Germany's navy, raised alarms about Britain's naval superiority, particularly the Royal Navy's ability to disrupt any landing attempt. Hitler acknowledged these concerns, but dismissed them with characteristic impatience, pressuring commanders to prepare regardless of logistical reality. The directive demanded that the Luftwaffe clear the skies of the RAF before troops could even think of landing. Furthermore, the German army was ordered to train divisions specifically for amphibious assault, something they had never attempted before on such a scale. Every branch of the military faced overwhelming challenges that required time, coordination, and resources. Yet Hitler insisted that preparations be completed swiftly, demonstrating his tendency to prioritize speed over feasibility. This tension between vision and practicality haunted the Sea Lion project from its inception. The invasion itself was envisioned in phases of destruction, domination, and occupation. First, the Luftwaffe, under Hermann Göring, was tasked with annihilating the RAF and destroying its airfields, radar stations, and fighter production centers. Without air superiority, the German army could not hope to cross the Channel. Second, once the skies were clear, the Kriegsmarine would secure narrow sea lanes across the Channel by deploying minesweepers, U-boats, and warships to protect the fragile invasion fleet of barges. Finally, the German army, led by seasoned divisions, would land in southern England, seize ports, and drive inland toward London. Hitler's directive painted a picture of inevitability, one in which the Wehrmacht simply marched forward once conditions were met. But beneath this facade of confidence lay glaring weaknesses: insufficient naval strength, reliance on converted river barges, and total dependence on the Luftwaffe. Still, the German propaganda machine portrayed Operation Sea Lion as unstoppable. Soldiers were told they would soon set foot on British soil. This combination of ambition and underestimation would prove crucial in shaping what followed. Operation Sea Lion's planning maps detailed 4 main landing zones along Britain's southern coast. The beaches of Kent and Sussex were identified as primary targets, with German divisions expected to storm ashore in tightly coordinated waves. Inland, paratroopers were assigned to capture vital bridges, crossroads, and communication hubs to paralyze British defences. The Wehrmacht calculated that if they could establish beachheads and prevent reinforcements, Britain's defence would collapse quickly. Yet the logistics of transporting 160,000 soldiers, thousands of vehicles, tanks, and supplies across the Channel was staggering. Germany lacked the specialized landing craft that the Allies would later perfect, leaving them to rely on shallow river barges. Many of these barges could not withstand rough seas, meaning even the weather posed a mortal threat to the plan. German engineers scrambled to adapt them, welding steel ramps and modifying hulls. Naval commanders doubted their ability to protect such vulnerable transports against the Royal Navy. Despite this, Hitler's directive demanded complete readiness by mid-August 1940, compressing planning into a dangerously narrow timeframe. The British, meanwhile, were far from passive targets, though Hitler underestimated their resilience. Churchill and his war cabinet knew that invasion was possible, even likely, and prepared defences accordingly. Along the coasts, pillboxes, trenches, and barbed wire sprang up almost overnight, forming what became known as the coastal crust. Bridges and roads inland were mined, and plans were drawn to flood low-lying areas to block German armor. The Home Guard, composed of volunteers often too old or young for active duty, trained with rifles, Molotov cocktails, and improvised weapons, ready to fight in the streets if necessary. British intelligence, through the efforts of MI5 and ultra code breakers, worked tirelessly to monitor German preparations. Propaganda fueled civilian resolve, encouraging people to stay calm and carry on while preparing for the worst. The population was instructed in blackouts, air raid drills, and evacuation protocols. Hitler's assumption of British collapse after France's fall proved a fatal misjudgment. Directive No. 16 was written under the belief that Britain lacked the will to resist. But Britain was bracing itself for a fight that would shock the world. Within the German command, debate raged fiercely over the invasion's feasibility. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder of the Kriegsmarine argued that without absolute air superiority, the invasion was a suicide mission. He stressed that the Royal Navy's destroyers and battleships, though battered, could still decimate Germany's fragile invasion barges. Hermann Göring, in contrast, promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe would crush the RAF in a matter of weeks, making the Royal Navy irrelevant. Army generals, eager for glory, sided with Göring, preferring to trust air power rather than admit naval weakness. These disagreements slowed planning and created dangerous overconfidence. Hitler himself vacillated, sometimes boasting of Britain's imminent defeat, other times delaying crucial orders. Directive No. 16 thus existed in a state of half-preparedness, driven more by political calculation than military consensus. German soldiers trained along the coast, rehearsing amphibious drills that often ended in chaos. The plan existed on paper as a masterpiece of ambition, but was fragile under scrutiny. Still, preparations continued, fueled by Hitler's determination to bring Britain to its knees. Directive No. 16 not only highlighted Hitler's strategic intent, but also reflected his psychological warfare approach. He believed that by announcing the invasion preparations, he could intimidate Britain into surrender without the need for actual fighting. German propaganda broadcasts warned the British people of imminent destruction, while leaflets rained from the skies predicting their doom. Hitler's speeches, dripping with confidence, framed the invasion as a punishment for Churchill's arrogance. In reality, this was a gamble, for if the invasion failed to materialize, it would expose German weakness. The psychological pressure was intended to weaken British morale before bombs or troops ever arrived. However, Churchill turned this strategy on its head, using Hitler's threats as fuel for British defiance. Instead of fear, the invasion rumors inspired resolve, uniting a population around the principle of survival. The directive, therefore, became a double-edged sword, raising expectations within Germany while hardening resistance across the Channel. Sea Lion was as much a battle of perception as of logistics, and in this war of nerves, Britain was proving far more resilient than Hitler anticipated. Ultimately, Directive No. 16 marked a turning point in Hitler's war strategy, for it revealed both his ambition and his blind spots. By placing faith entirely in the Luftwaffe, he underestimated the complexities of combined arms operations. By assuming Britain would crumble under threat alone, he ignored centuries of naval dominance and national stubbornness. The directive set in motion the Battle of Britain, for before any soldier could step foot on British shores, the RAF had to be destroyed. This shifted the entire conflict from land and sea to the skies above the Channel. Germany prepared for what they believed would be a short, decisive struggle. Britain prepared for a drawn-out, existential fight. The clash of these expectations would shape the outcome of the battle. Directive No. 16, for all its authority and grandeur, was less a plan of certainty than a leap of faith. It was Hitler's challenge to Britain, daring it to resist. And in the skies of 1940, Britain would answer. The English Channel, deceptively narrow at its closest point, became one of Hitler's greatest obstacles in 1940. At just over 20 miles wide between Dover and Calais, it seemed almost laughably small compared to the vast distances the Wehrmacht had already conquered across Europe. Yet this body of water was not just a geographical feature, it was a natural fortress. Its shifting tides, unpredictable currents, and notorious storms turned it into a treacherous gauntlet for any invading fleet. German planners who had grown accustomed to swift land campaigns now faced the daunting reality of maritime warfare. Unlike France, Poland, or the Low Countries, Britain was protected not by fortifications but by nature itself. The shallow seabed limited the anchoring of heavy warships, forcing reliance on smaller, vulnerable craft. These limitations meant even assembling a crossing force was an unprecedented logistical nightmare. The Wehrmacht had no history of large-scale amphibious warfare, unlike the British, who had mastered it over centuries of empire. Geography had, in essence, made Britain an island fortress that would not be easily stormed. Buer fell. The tides of the English Channel were as much an enemy as the Royal Navy. Strong tidal flows meant that any invasion fleet needed meticulous timing to land troops and supplies successfully. A miscalculation could scatter barges and leave soldiers stranded or drowned before even reaching the shore. Weather compounded this danger, with thick fogs rolling in without warning and sudden storms capable of capsizing entire convoys. German meteorologists warned their superiors that the window for a safe crossing was narrow and unpredictable. In summer, calmer seas were more common, but by autumn violent winds swept through with relentless force. To the British, these natural elements were invisible allies working in their favor. To the Germans, each day of delay pushed them closer to seasonal changes that could doom the operation. Operation Sea Lion on paper was bold, but in practice the geography of the Channel was merciless. Every wave, gust and tide became part of Britain's silent defense. Britain's coastline itself was a formidable barrier, dotted with natural and man-made obstacles. The southeastern shores, where invasion was most likely, had long stretches of sandy beaches, flanked by chalk cliffs and marshlands. These cliffs, especially around Dover, gave British spotters high vantage points to detect approaching forces. Inland, the landscape quickly narrowed into hedgerows, villages, and winding country roads that could funnel invaders into bottlenecks. The British Army, though battered from Dunkirk, prepared defences with barbed wire, mines, and pillboxes set along these beaches. German reconnaissance photographs revealed how difficult it would be to land heavy equipment on these terrains. Tanks could bog down in marshy soil or be funneled into predictable choke points. The Wehrmacht excelled in blitzkrieg across open plains, but Britain's coastal geography offered no such opportunities. Every inch of beach was a trap, and every cliff a fortress. Geography once again gave defenders an edge that no plan could fully neutralize. Another complication was the sheer distance of supply lines that stretched across the Channel. A modern army, especially one as mechanized as the Wehrmacht, consumed staggering amounts of fuel, ammunition, and food. To sustain even a fraction of its divisions in southern England, the Germans needed a constant flow of supplies from occupied France. This would require fleets of barges and ferries, vessels never designed for open sea crossings. Many were converted river barges with flat bottoms, easily swamped by rough waters. Even in calm seas, these craft could move only at a crawl, making them easy prey for the Royal Navy and RAF. Every mile travelled across the Channel was a gamble, with geography conspiring to delay, scatter, and expose them. Once ashore, the logistical nightmare deepened, as British infrastructure had been prepared for defence, not invasion. The Channel was not just a moat, it was a living obstacle that threatened to strangle Operation Sea Lion before it even began. Weather over the Channel had long been infamous among sailors. Sudden squalls could whip waves into towering walls of water within hours. Dense fog could blind pilots and navigators, turning fleets into disorganized targets. Even the Luftwaffe, which had dominated continental skies, found the conditions unpredictable and treacherous. Crosswinds could scatter bomber formations, forcing them to attack piecemeal instead of in waves. The Royal Air Force, flying from familiar ground, could exploit breaks in the weather to strike suddenly and vanish again. The Germans discovered that their own pilots, used to operating over stable continental climates, struggled with these maritime challenges. To the British, this erratic weather was not a hindrance but a shield. Each storm delayed German preparations, each fog bank confused enemy reconnaissance. The geography of the Channel was not passive, it actively fought against the invaders at every turn. Hitler's grand designs collided with the raw, untamable force of nature. The Royal Navy's dominance was also a direct result of geography. Britain's insular position forced it, for centuries, to develop the strongest navy in the world. Ports along the Channel, Portsmouth, Plymouth and Chatham, stood ready to deploy warships within hours of an invasion warning. Even if the Luftwaffe won air superiority, Germany could not eliminate the Royal Navy's ability to intervene. The shallow waters and narrow straits meant U-boats, Germany's most effective naval weapon, had limited effectiveness close to shore. German planners knew that even a small British fleet could scatter and annihilate the slow-moving invasion barges. The Navy did not need to win, it simply had to prevent the crossing from succeeding. Geography concentrated British power while dispersing German strength. Every mile of Channel water was controlled, not by barges, but by the spectre of the Royal Navy. The island fortress had its moat, and within it prowled a navy determined to defend it. The geography of Britain itself, beyond the coastlines, posed challenges to any would-be occupier. The island's interior was crisscrossed with rivers, hills, and dense hedgerows that fragmented movement. These natural features were easily defensible by smaller, mobile British forces. London, the heart of the nation, lay further inland, meaning invaders would have to fight through layers of countryside resistance. The Germans, accustomed to vast flat terrain in Europe, would find themselves slowed at every turn. Each village could become a fortress, each roadblock a killing ground. Geography transformed the entire island into a battlefield that inherently favored defenders. The Wehrmacht's rapid advances, so effective on continental highways, would be blunted on Britain's narrow, winding roads. The invaders would be fighting not just soldiers, but the very terrain itself. To conquer Britain meant overcoming more than people. It meant defeating the land that sheltered them. UC Twales. In the end, the English Channel was not simply water separating two nations. It was history's most consequential natural barrier. Its tides, weather, and geography forced Hitler's war machine into a form of combat for which it was utterly unprepared. Every plan, from barges to air cover, collided with the merciless reality of the Channel's challenges. For Britain, this narrow strip of sea became the shield that preserved its survival. The failure to cross it meant the failure of Operation Sea Lion, and with it, Hitler's chance to crush the last bastion of resistance in Western Europe. Geography, so often overlooked, proved as decisive as any general or battle. The The Channel turned ambition into futility, transforming Hitler's bold directive into a distant dream. Britain's survival rested not only on courage, but also on the unforgiving nature of the seas. The moat of history had held firm, and in doing so changed the fate of the world. In the summer of 1940, the German war machine appeared unstoppable, a juggernaut of steel and discipline that had already crushed Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France in a matter of months. The Wehrmacht was hailed across Europe as a modern marvel of organization and coordination, blending tanks, infantry, and aircraft in lightning-fast offensives. This approach, known as blitzkrieg, had become synonymous with German victory, its shock and awe leaving enemy nations paralyzed before they could respond. The panzers spearheaded these offensives, rolling through defenses with ruthless precision, supported by motorized infantry who exploited every breakthrough. Overhead, the Luftwaffe rained destruction, softening resistance, and disrupting communication lines with relentless air raids. German propaganda painted these triumphs as evidence of destiny, suggesting no force on earth could withstand their might. Yet beneath the sheen of invincibility, cracks already began to form in their military structure. Their rapid victories had been achieved against nations unprepared for such tactics, with outdated strategies and poor coordination. Britain, however, was a different kind of enemy, an island nation protected by geography and supplied by a vast global empire. To defeat it, Germany would need more than shock tactics. It would require endurance, resources, and overwhelming dominance, qualities their war machine did not fully possess. At the heart of Germany's strength lay the Wehrmacht, an army whose discipline, training, and professionalism were unparalleled in Europe at the time. Soldiers were indoctrinated with a belief in their superiority, drilled relentlessly, and conditioned to execute orders without hesitation. The Wehrmacht had inherited the traditions of the Prussian military, efficiency, precision, and obedience, yet now supercharged by Hitler's ideological drive and technological modernity. German infantry divisions were supported by motorized units, allowing rapid redeployment across fronts, giving them flexibility their enemies lacked. Their artillery, though not always the heaviest, was expertly coordinated, ensuring devastating barrages at critical moments of attack. Tanks like the Panzer III and IV, though modest in armor compared to later war machines, were fast, mobile, and deadly in coordinated operations. More than equipment, however, it was the integration of arms, the seamless choreography of tanks, infantry, and air support that gave Germany its edge. Commanders operated with a doctrine of Auftragstaktik, or mission command, granting officers autonomy to adapt to changing battlefield conditions. This adaptability meant the Wehrmacht could exploit chaos rather than be hindered by it. To Britain and the world, the Wehrmacht of 1940 seemed invincible, but appearances masked looming weaknesses. The Luftwaffe, commanded by Hermann Göring, stood as the most formidable component of the German military machine in 1940. It had proven devastating in Poland and France, annihilating enemy air forces on the ground, and providing unrelenting support for advancing troops. German bombers, like the Heinkel He 111, Dornier Du 17, and Junkers Ju 88, could saturate enemy cities and defenses, while the fearsome Stuka dive bombers screamed through the sky, their sirens sowing terror before impact. Fighter protection came from the Messerschmitt Bf 109, a sleek and deadly aircraft capable of outclassing most Allied fighters in speed and climb. The Luftwaffe seemed to embody modern war, replacing the slow attritional battles of World War I with dynamic, high-speed dominance. Göring himself boasted that his Luftwaffe could bring Britain to its knees within weeks, reducing its defences to rubble. Yet the Luftwaffe had not been designed for a long strategic bombing campaign. It was a tactical air force, optimized for short, brutal bursts of support for ground operations. Its bombers lacked the range and payload of Britain's heavy bombers, while its fighters, though deadly, had limited fuel reserves that would prove crippling in extended battles over enemy territory. In truth, the Luftwaffe was formidable, but untested in the kind of protracted struggle it was about to face. Despite their brilliance in offense, Germany's tanks revealed inherent weaknesses once the dust of conquest settled. The Panzer I and II, which still formed a large portion of the armoured divisions, were lightly armed and armoured, useful mainly for reconnaissance and infantry support. Even the Panzer III and IV, the best of Germany's arsenal in 1940, carried relatively light guns compared to what the Allies would field in later years. German tank crews, however, compensated with skill, coordination, and superior radio communication, which allowed them to outmaneuver less organized enemies. Still, when faced with the British Matilda II, a heavily armored tank encountered in France, German panzers found themselves often outgunned and reliant on artillery or dive bombers to neutralize the threat. This reliance exposed a crucial truth. Germany's victories were not purely a product of superior machines, but of strategy, surprise, and coordination. As the war dragged on, these technological shortcomings would grow more apparent, especially when enemies adapted to blitzkrieg tactics. For the moment, however, the illusion of unstoppable power was enough to keep their adversaries on the defensive. Germany's tanks embodied the paradox of its military lethal in the short term, but lacking long-term resilience. German logistics, often overshadowed by tales of battlefield brilliance, represented both a strength and a weakness of the Wehrmacht. In their lightning campaigns, supply lines could keep pace with advancing troops, thanks to motorization and meticulous planning. However, Germany's reliance on horses, millions of them, was a relic of an older age, hidden behind the modern facade of tanks and trucks. Nearly 75% of German logistics still depended on animal power, dragging carts of ammunition, food, and supplies through mud and rain. This reality severely limited their ability to sustain prolonged operations far from their bases of supply. Fuel was another Achilles heel, as Germany lacked significant natural oil reserves and depended on synthetic fuel production and imports, both of which strained under wartime demands. In short, the German war machine looked like a marvel of modernity, but was still shackled by the limitations of pre-industrial logistics. For Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, this meant supplying troops across the English Channel, a logistical nightmare that Germany was ill-prepared to face. The Wehrmacht could deliver crushing blows, but whether it could sustain them was a question Hitler had not yet answered. Another critical weakness lay in the structure of the Luftwaffe itself. Goering, for all his flamboyance and loyalty to Hitler, was not a master strategist, often allowing ego and political loyalty to outweigh military necessity. The Luftwaffe lacked a coherent long-term doctrine for strategic bombing, oscillating between targeting Britain's airfields, its radar stations, and its cities. This lack of clarity revealed the limitations of Germany's planning. They had prepared for quick wars of conquest, not long grinding battles of attrition. Additionally, while the Bf 109 was a formidable fighter, its short range meant German pilots often had only minutes of combat over British skies before fuel forced them home. The twin-engine Bf 110, envisioned as a long-range escort fighter, proved disastrously vulnerable to faster, more maneuverable RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes. These flaws, invisible during the swift campaigns in Europe, now threatened to unravel the Luftwaffe's aura of invincibility. The myth of German air superiority would soon be tested in a way it never had before. The greatest hidden weakness of the German war machine was its overextension. Hitler's victories had come so swiftly that his regime began to believe in its own propaganda that Germany could not be stopped. Yet each conquest added vast territories to control, populations to police, and fronts to defend. Resources stretched thinner with every success. And the Wehrmacht, for all its brilliance, was not infinite. Britain, with its empire and access to American production, had the potential to outlast Germany in a war of attrition. German officers knew this, though few dared to voice it openly to Hitler, who clung to his vision of inevitable triumph. The war machine that looked unstoppable in 1940 was in truth a giant running on momentum, not invulnerability. Britain's survival, should it endure the storm, would expose just how fragile this colossus truly was. In 1940, as the plans for the invasion of Britain developed, the German war machine stood at a crossroads between brilliance and overreach. Its strengths were undeniable: disciplined troops, innovative tactics, and an air force that inspired terror. Yet its weaknesses, logistics, fuel shortages, limited naval power, and an air force ill-suited for strategic endurance, were equally real. Germany's triumphs had been built on speed and surprise, not sustainability. Britain, isolated but resilient, represented the first true test of whether the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe could wage war against a prepared, determined opponent. For Hitler, it was a gamble between the reality of his forces' limitations and the illusion of their invincibility. The outcome of this confrontation would decide whether the German war machine was truly the master of Europe, or merely a force destined to collapse under its own flaws. The stage was set for a battle, not just of strength, but of endurance, where Germany's weaknesses would slowly come into focus. In the summer of 1940, Britain stood as the lone bulwark against a Nazi tide that had swept across the continent with terrifying speed. France, once a proud ally, had crumbled in a matter of weeks, its army shattered, and its government in disarray. Across the Channel, ordinary Britons awoke to the grim reality that they were now Hitler's next target, the last significant power resisting German domination. Winston Churchill, newly installed as Prime Minister, recognized the peril, yet refused to surrender to despair. His words in Parliament, declaring that Britain would fight on the beaches, were more than rhetoric. They were a lifeline to a nation reeling from shock. Every household listened anxiously to the radio, knowing the storm clouds of war were gathering overhead. The sense of isolation was overwhelming, for Britain could no longer rely on continental allies. The only constant was the Royal Navy, patrolling the seas like silent guardians of the island. To the people, Britain's survival seemed uncertain, but the spirit of defiance was already beginning to kindle. It was a spirit that would define the nation in its darkest hour. 6. Churchill's rise to power came at precisely the moment Britain needed a leader unwilling to compromise with tyranny. Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement had collapsed in humiliation, leaving the nation's faith in its politicians deeply shaken. But Churchill brought a ferocity and clarity of vision that cut through despair. He spoke to the people not with platitudes, but with raw honesty, acknowledging the gravity of the danger while offering unflinching resolve. "We shall never surrender," he proclaimed, and those words echoed in factories, fields, and classrooms across the nation. His speeches were not just oratory, they were weapons of morale, steeling a people to resist an enemy that appeared invincible. Britain stood alone geographically, but Churchill reminded them they were not alone morally. The empire still stretched across the globe, and though far away, its resources could be marshaled for the struggle. More importantly, he spoke to the idea that freedom itself was at stake, that if Britain fell, darkness would engulf the world. This message gave ordinary men and women a reason to endure fear and sacrifice. Life on the home front reflected the precarious balance between dread and determination. Blackout curtains covered every window, ensuring not a single light guided German bombers across the night sky. Air raid sirens wailed unpredictably, forcing families into cramped shelters where they clutched one another and prayed the bombs would fall elsewhere. Children were evacuated from cities to the countryside, their faces pale with fear as they boarded trains that carried them away from their parents. Yet amidst the uncertainty, communities came together in ways previously unimaginable. Neighbors shared rations, volunteers patrolled the streets, and the sense of shared sacrifice bound the population with threads of resilience. Posters reminded citizens to keep calm and carry on, a phrase that captured both the stoic humor and quiet courage of the British people. Every day brought new rumors of invasion, whispers of paratroopers ready to descend upon the fields. But despite sleepless nights and gnawing fear, the nation's morale did not collapse. Instead, the adversity fostered a spirit of collective endurance, one that Hitler could neither bomb nor intimidate. The British military was in no condition to fight a full-scale invasion, and yet preparations began with frantic urgency. After Dunkirk, much of the British Army had returned without equipment, leaving its soldiers armed with little more than determination. Makeshift defences were erected along the coastlines, barbed wire, mines, and hastily built pillboxes. The Home Guard, often mocked as Dad's Army, was mobilized, composed of older men, clerks, and factory workers determined to resist. They drilled with broomsticks, hunting rifles, or any weapon they could find, embodying the will of civilians to stand their ground. The regular army worked feverishly to rearm, relying on factories to churn out rifles, tanks, and ammunition at breakneck speed. Civil defense units prepared for chemical attacks, remembering the horrors of the First World War. Britain's skies became the true battleground, however, as the Royal Air Force scrambled to prepare for the storm. In workshops and airfields, mechanics worked around the clock to repair Spitfires and Hurricanes. The sense was clear: the fight for survival would be total, involving soldier and civilian alike. Churchill's speeches inspired, but it was the daily actions of ordinary Britons that gave substance to the idea of national defiance. Women took up jobs in factories, riveting aircraft parts and producing munitions, ensuring that the front lines would not go without supplies. Farmers increased production despite shortages, ploughing through fields under the threat of Luftwaffe raids. Children collected scrap metal, rubber, and paper for recycling, turning the war effort into a collective responsibility. Civil defense wardens patrolled neighborhoods, enforcing blackouts and assisting during raids. Fire brigades fought infernos caused by bombs, risking their lives to save homes and landmarks. In churches and town halls, communities gathered to listen to news broadcasts and offer mutual encouragement. Even the smallest acts of normality, a shared cup of tea, a song sung around the piano, became statements of resilience. This culture of endurance turned the act of living itself into resistance. Every citizen understood that their role mattered, whether in the fields, the factories, or the shelters, and together their perseverance became the foundation upon which Britain stood alone. Morale, however, was not uniformly steady, and the government recognized the need to manage information carefully. The Ministry of Information produced films and newsreels portraying Britain as steadfast and unyielding. These carefully crafted images showed smiling factory workers, brave airmen, and cheerful families, even when the reality was far harsher. Censorship limited reports of defeat or destruction, ensuring that hope was never extinguished. Yet, even without propaganda, the resilience of the people was remarkable. The shared sense of danger made class distinctions blur, as aristocrats, workers, and clerks all endured the same sirens and shelters. This levelling of society fostered a unity that Britain had rarely known before. The monarchy too played its part, with King George VI and Queen Elizabeth visiting bombed neighbourhoods, comforting survivors. Their presence reassured the public that even the highest officers were not insulated from danger. The idea of standing alone was not just a political slogan, it was a lived experience felt in every street and household. Internationally, Britain's isolation was profound, yet Churchill worked tirelessly to change it. He cultivated ties with the United States, appealing to President Franklin Roosevelt for aid despite American reluctance to enter the war. Supplies began to flow under programs like Cash and Carry, providing Britain with weapons and raw materials. Still, these were stopgaps, and Churchill knew that without greater support, Britain's position would remain precarious. Appeals to the Empire also bore fruit, as troops from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and India prepared to defend the mother country. This global dimension reminded Britons that they were not entirely alone, even if immediate reinforcements were limited. Churchill framed the struggle as one of civilization versus barbarism, drawing moral support from around the world. The BBC broadcast messages across occupied Europe, encouraging resistance and hope. Britain's voice, though isolated geographically, carried across the airwaves as a symbol of defiance. In the darkest months, these diplomatic and symbolic efforts bolstered morale as much as any physical defense. Yes. By the end of 1940, Britain had endured what many believed would break it, and yet it had not bent. The Luftwaffe's raids were brutal, but the island still stood unconquered, its people bloodied but unbowed. Churchill's gamble, to inspire rather than placate, to fight rather than surrender, had succeeded in keeping the nation united. The sense of being alone, once terrifying, became a badge of honour, a narrative of resilience that bound the people together. Britain's very survival became proof that Hitler's might was not absolute. The stage was set for a new phase of conflict, one in which air power, naval supremacy, and morale would be tested in equal measure. Though resources were stretched and the future uncertain, the foundation had been laid for endurance. The British people had accepted hardship and fear as part of their daily lives. More importantly, they had proven to themselves and the world that they would not collapse under pressure. Britain stood alone, and in standing alone it had set the tone for the battles yet to come. In the summer of 1940, with the threat of German invasion hanging over every town and village, Britain's coastline transformed into a fortress in the making. The beaches, once a place of leisure and holiday relaxation, now became militarized zones lined with barbed wire and watchtowers. Every inch of shoreline was studied carefully, from the white cliffs of Dover to the sandy stretches of southern England, to anticipate where German troops might land. Civil engineers, soldiers, and volunteers worked day and night to construct layers of defense against a possible assault. The government authorized a massive program of coastal fortifications, creating a visible reminder of the danger Britain faced. Abandoned buildings near beaches were demolished to prevent their use as cover for enemy troops. Trees were felled, roads were obstructed, and open fields were mined to deny tanks and infantry easy passage inland. Every resource was diverted toward transforming Britain into what Winston Churchill called a steel island of resistance. Even as bombs fell from the sky, thousands labored with picks, shovels, and concrete mixers to raise defenses that might never be tested. The sense of urgency was absolute, and the coastline became the front line of Britain's survival. Pillboxes, small, hardened concrete bunkers, sprang up across the countryside like silent guardians. Designed to house a handful of men armed with rifles or machine guns, these squat structures offered overlapping fields of fire across beaches, bridges, and key road junctions. They were camouflaged to blend into hedgerows, painted to resemble farm buildings, or disguised within existing walls. Some were built to withstand direct hits from artillery, with walls several feet thick, while others were simpler and more makeshift. The intent was not elegance but endurance, sturdy boxes of concrete that would force German infantry into deadly kill zones. Over 28,000 pillboxes were constructed in just a few months, scattered like a defensive net across the land. Each one became a symbol of ordinary Britons preparing to resist extraordinary odds. Soldiers stationed within them knew that survival was unlikely, but their mission was to delay, bleed, and disorganize an invader long enough for reinforcements to respond. Even schoolboys and retirees helped mix the concrete and carry stones for their construction. The pillbox, ugly yet unyielding, embodied the grim determination of a nation preparing for its darkest hour. The beaches themselves became carefully engineered barriers against invasion. Wide stretches of sand were crisscrossed with barbed wire entanglements, designed to snare soldiers and slow advancing vehicles. Iron scaffolding, known as beach obstacles, was erected to damage landing craft or impale incoming boats. Huge metal frames called hedgehogs were embedded into the sand to rip apart tank treads. Some areas were deliberately flooded to create swamps, while others were studded with anti-tank blocks the size of small cars. Mines were buried in unpredictable patterns to keep enemy troops guessing and terrified. Warning signs painted in bold letters, "Danger mines," became a familiar sight, often scrawled onto planks hammered into the sand. Beaches that once hosted children with buckets and spades now held death traps waiting to be sprung. Farmers lost access to fields, fishermen were denied their traditional routes, and local communities felt the weight of militarization pressing down on daily life. Every grain of sand, once a symbol of carefree summer days, became part of a battlefield that no German soldier would find easy to cross. Behind the beaches, Britain created layers of secondary defenses to prevent any breakthrough from spreading inland. The most famous of these was the so-called stop line system, which divided the country into defensive zones. Rivers, canals, and rail embankments were integrated into military planning, reinforced with pillboxes and roadblocks. Bridges were rigged with explosives so they could be destroyed at a moment's notice if the enemy advanced. Concrete cubes were positioned in rows across open ground, creating mazes that would stall tanks and funnel them into killing zones. Soldiers dug anti-tank ditches, often hundreds of yards long, creating artificial ravines impossible for armored vehicles to cross. These defensive belts stretched across southern and eastern England like invisible scars on the land. Entire landscapes were reshaped to create natural fortresses, ensuring that even if German troops gained a foothold, they would find themselves trapped and isolated. The countryside became an elaborate chessboard of military engineering, where every move by the invader had already been anticipated. This meticulous preparation underscored Britain's refusal to collapse without a fight. While engineers and soldiers worked on hard defenses, the Home Guard added another layer of vigilance. Nicknamed Dad's Army, this volunteer force of older men too young or too old for regular service took on the burden of guarding towns, roads, and railways. Armed with rifles, shotguns, and sometimes little more than makeshift weapons, they trained to repel paratroopers and saboteurs. Their presence freed up regular troops to focus on frontline duties, while ensuring that no part of Britain was left unprotected. At night they patrolled the countryside, listening for the sound of enemy aircraft or suspicious movements. Improvised barricades were built from logs, old vehicles, and scrap metal, blocking key roadways in anticipation of German mechanized columns. These men drilled tirelessly, often after long days of work in factories or farms, embodying the civilian spirit of resistance. Though sometimes mocked in later years, their contribution to national morale was enormous. They gave every community a sense of readiness and reassurance that someone stood watch, even in the darkest hours of the blackout. The Home Guard transformed civilians into soldiers in spirit, if not in uniform. Every village, town, and city in coastal regions felt the weight of preparation. Civilians were enlisted into building networks of trenches, air raid shelters, and lookout posts. Children carried gas masks to school, and families drilled in emergency procedures for invasion scenarios. Beaches were closed to the public, and seaside towns that once thrived on tourism fell silent under military occupation. Entire communities were displaced when defense projects cut across farmland or urban centers. Posters urged vigilance with slogans like "Careless talk costs lives" and "Dig for victory." Even churchyards and cricket pitches were commandeered for defensive works. Railway stations bristled with sandbags, and public buildings were reinforced against bomb blasts. The war effort blurred the line between soldier and civilian, making every citizen a participant in Britain's survival. The ordinary rhythms of life were disrupted by an ever-present expectation: the enemy might land tomorrow. This atmosphere of constant vigilance forged a collective sense of sacrifice and unity. Strategists understood that defenses were not merely physical barriers but psychological weapons. The sight of pillboxes, barbed wire, and minefields served as a warning to German planners. Any invasion would be costly. Propaganda films showed workers building fortifications, reinforcing the idea that Britain was prepared to repel any attacker. The existence of these defenses also bolstered civilian confidence, turning fear into determination. Soldiers stationed at coastal outposts drew strength from the knowledge that they stood behind formidable obstacles. Even if the Luftwaffe tried to soften up these positions with bombings, the sheer depth of Britain's layered defences made success unlikely. The coast became both shield and symbol, a visible declaration of defiance to Hitler and reassurance to the British people. The very act of preparation was a form of resistance, transforming vulnerability into resilience. Britain was telling both its enemy and its citizens, "We are ready." By the end of 1940, Britain's beaches were no longer places of leisure, but stark front lines waiting for a battle that might never come. Every stretch of coastline bore the imprint of fear, urgency, and determination. From Dover's cliffs to Cornwall's coves, each region prepared for invasion in its own way, weaving a patchwork of fortifications across the island. Soldiers trained relentlessly in amphibious defense drills, rehearsing scenarios of enemy landings under fire. Engineers refined obstacles, tested explosives, and improved camouflage to outwit German reconnaissance. The defenses, though sometimes rudimentary, were so extensive that historians later remarked any German landing would have been a nightmare of slaughter. The beaches of Britain had been transformed into a living battlefield in waiting, bristling with steel, concrete, and watchful eyes. Though the invasion never came, the preparation itself became a monumental testament to Britain's resolve. The sight of those defences, grim, unyielding, and silent, remains one of the most enduring symbols of a nation standing alone against tyranny. When the German High Command turned its eyes across the Channel, Hermann Göring and his Luftwaffe assumed the central role in making invasion possible. Hitler's Directive No. 16 made it clear that no landing could take place until the British skies were cleared of their defenders. To Goering, this was both a challenge and an opportunity, as the Luftwaffe had proven its worth during the lightning campaigns in Poland, the Low Countries and France. The Air Force had played the decisive role in breaking the French defences at Sedan and outmanoeuvring the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk. Now it was tasked with crushing the Royal Air Force and securing the heavens above England. Goering, arrogant and flamboyant, promised that his Luftwaffe would sweep the RAF aside within weeks. He was convinced that the weight of German numbers, the speed of their aircraft, and the training of their crews would prove irresistible. The Battle of Britain, therefore, would begin not on the ground, but in the skies. The Luftwaffe's primary strategy was to achieve total air superiority as a prerequisite to Operation Sea Lion. German planners believed that, without the neutralization of fighter command, any invasion fleet would be slaughtered in the Channel by British aircraft. Thus, the first phase of the campaign was designed to lure RAF fighters into the air, engage them, and destroy them faster than they could be replaced. Luftwaffe intelligence estimated that Britain had around 700 frontline fighters, and Goering calculated that within 4 weeks the RAF would be bled dry. This assumption drove the tempo of the air war in July and August 1940. Squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Bf 110s would escort vast waves of Heinkel, Dornier and Junkers bombers over the Channel to provoke combat. Goering hoped the constant hammering would erode British morale and drain their reserves. Yet beneath this confidence lay critical flaws in planning, logistics, and underestimation of Britain's resolve. Bliske. The Luftwaffe's strategy relied heavily on its fighter arm, particularly the Messerschmitt Bf 109. This aircraft, sleek, fast, and well armed, was considered the best single-engine fighter in Europe at the time. Capable of climbing quickly and armed with cannon and machine guns, it was deadly in dogfights. But it had one crippling weakness: range. Operating from bases in northern France, the 109s had barely enough fuel to escort bombers to London and return. Once engaged in prolonged combat over southern England, pilots were often forced to break off early, leaving bombers exposed. The twin-engine Bf 110, designed as a long-range escort, also failed to perform as expected. Though powerful, it was clumsy compared to the nimble British Spitfires and Hurricanes. The weakness of German escort tactics would prove one of the decisive vulnerabilities in Goering's grand plan. The bomber force formed the backbone of Goering's assault. The Luftwaffe fielded hundreds of Heinkel He 111 SES, Dornier Do 17 SES, and Junkers Do 88 S, which were designed for precision strikes on enemy infrastructure. These bombers had performed brilliantly in the Blitzkrieg campaigns, devastating rail networks, bridges, and airfields. Against Britain, the plan was to obliterate fighter commands' air bases, radar stations, and aircraft factories. Without these lifelines, the RAF would wither away in days. Yet the limitations of the bombers soon became apparent. Their defensive armament was weak, their bomb loads insufficient for strategic destruction, and their accuracy questionable without advanced bomb sights. When British fighters intercepted them en masse, the bombers suffered heavy losses. Goering's boast of overwhelming the RAF began to look increasingly fragile. Intelligence and planning also suffered from overconfidence. German reconnaissance underestimated the depth of Britain's radar network and the coordination provided by the Dowding system. Luftwaffe strategists assumed that radar masts were little more than tall metal poles, easily destroyed with a few bombing runs. In practice, Britain's radar coverage was resilient, with overlapping stations and rapid repair teams. The Germans also failed to grasp how effectively the British integrated radar, ground controllers, and fighter squadrons into one seamless defense. As a result, every time German bombers crossed the Channel, RAF fighters were waiting. What the Luftwaffe intended as quick, decisive raids often turned into prolonged aerial battles in which German losses mounted alarmingly. The very system Göring dismissed as irrelevant became the backbone of Britain's survival. Göring also underestimated the psychological resilience of the British population. Part of his strategy involved the belief that terror bombing would break civilian morale and force the government to sue for peace. The Luftwaffe had already tested this theory in cities like Warsaw and Rotterdam. In Britain, however, the results were different. When London and other cities were bombed, far from collapsing, the British spirit hardened. Civilians sheltered in underground stations, emergency services rushed the ruins, and propaganda celebrated the courage of ordinary men and women. Instead of weakening Churchill's position, the bombings strengthened his defiance. The Luftwaffe's failure to account for this cultural resilience would become another nail in the coffin of Operation Sea Lion. Strategically, the Luftwaffe faced immense logistical challenges in sustaining its campaign. The rapid blitzkrieg advances had strained German supply chains, and airfields in northern France were not fully prepared for the intensity of daily operations. Maintenance crews were stretched, spare parts were scarce, and bomber groups suffered mechanical breakdowns at an alarming rate. Meanwhile, British aircraft factories, working around the clock, were producing fighters faster than the Luftwaffe destroyed them. For every Spitfire or Hurricane lost, replacements rolled out of factories, often in greater numbers. By contrast, the Luftwaffe lacked a comparable reserve system, and its attrition rate steadily increased. What began as a confident offensive strategy turned into a war of endurance that the Germans were ill prepared to fight. Ultimately, Göring's grand vision of crushing the RAF collapsed under the weight of flawed assumptions, poor intelligence, and British resilience. The Luftwaffe strategy was bold but not sustainable, relying on quick victory rather than long-term pressure. Each raid across the Channel drained Germany's pilots and machines, while British resolve only stiffened. The Luftwaffe could inflict terrible destruction, but it could not achieve the decisive knockout blow it promised Hitler. Air superiority remained elusive, and with it, Operation Sea Lion faded into impossibility. Göring had wagered everything on the strength of his air force, but by the autumn of 1940, it was clear that the skies belonged to Britain. The failure of the Luftwaffe's strategy would mark not only the first major defeat of the German war machine, but also a turning point in the global struggle. As the Luftwaffe's waves of bombers thundered over southern England, the Royal Air Force faced the gravest test in its history. Britain's survival depended on Fighter Command, a small but determined force led by Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding. Dowding's genius lay not only in his understanding of aircraft and tactics, but in his foresight in integrating technology with human skill. The Chain Home Radar Network, still considered experimental by many, became the backbone of Britain's early warning system. Operators scoured the skies for approaching formations, plotting their courses and relaying critical information to sector control centers. Fighter squadrons were vectored efficiently to intercept enemy aircraft before they reached the heartland. Every decision was a race against time, with minutes separating disaster from salvation. Pilots, many barely out of training, understood that every sortie could decide the fate of their nation. Morale was fragile, yet steeled by a sense of historic duty. From the control rooms to the cockpits, Britain's defense functioned as a single coordinated organism. The pilots of Fighter Command, later immortalized as the few, carried the weight of the nation on their shoulders. Young men from Britain, Canada, Poland, Czechoslovakia, New Zealand, and South Africa joined forces, bringing diverse experience and shared courage. Spitfires and Hurricanes became extensions of their will, slicing through skies with precision and speed. Each dogfight was a delicate dance of altitude, speed, and firepower, requiring split-second decisions under extreme stress. RAF pilots learned to exploit the weaknesses of the Messerschmitt 109S and 110S, using superior maneuverability to outflank and disable their adversaries. Formation flying, disciplined wing tactics, and constant communication with ground control made interception efficient and lethal. The exhaustion was relentless. Pilots often flew multiple sorties per day, barely resting before climbing again. Despite heavy losses, their resolve never wavered. Each victory in the air lifted civilian morale and symbolized defiance against tyranny. The few became both warriors and icons, embodying Britain's determination to resist invasion. WW2 radar, still a novel technology in 1940, proved decisive in the aerial struggle. Chain home stations along the southern and eastern coasts continuously scanned for incoming raids, measuring altitude, direction, and speed. Operators relayed this information to sector control rooms, where plotting officers quickly identified the size and path of enemy formations. This early warning system allowed fighters to be scrambled efficiently, conserving fuel and ensuring maximum coverage. Ground observers supplemented radar, visually confirming reports and tracking aircraft in cloudy or low visibility conditions. Dowding's meticulous coordination meant that pilots rarely flew blind into the massed Luftwaffe formations. Each interception was choreographed, with fighters directed to advantageous positions before the enemy could react. The integration of radar and human judgment created a force multiplier that offset the Luftwaffe's numerical advantage. Pilots trusted the system implicitly, relying on data relayed from miles away. This technological edge, combined with skill and courage, became Britain's shield in the sky. The Luftwaffe underestimated both the RAF and the British public's resilience, garnering expected panic, believing that relentless bombing would shatter morale and force a rapid surrender. Instead, civilians adapted to the raids, seeking refuge in underground stations and air raid shelters, while emergency services rushed to repair bomb damage. The RAF's successes in intercepting bombers prevented the Luftwaffe from achieving strategic objectives, frustrating German planners. Pilots returning from combat were greeted by streets lined with cheering citizens and fellow servicemen, reinforcing a shared sense of purpose. Aircraft factories, heavily camouflaged and often operating at night, replaced lost fighters faster than they were destroyed. This logistical robustness, combined with effective tactics, allowed fighter command to sustain the fight over prolonged periods. Air battles became contests of endurance as well as skill. Even as the Luftwaffe intensified raids, RAF pilots displayed a level of resilience that would define the campaign. The battle was not just fought in the skies, but within the hearts of every Briton determined to resist. Dogfights over southern England reached epic proportions, a ballet of destruction and skill. Spitfires engaged Messerschmitts at varying altitudes, twisting and turning to gain the optimal firing position. Hurricanes targeted bombers, aiming to disable engines and rip formations apart before they could reach their targets. Clouds, sun glare, and smoke from anti-aircraft fire added layers of danger and complexity. Pilots experienced extreme G-forces, fatigue, and the constant threat of being shot down over enemy territory. Each sortie demanded mastery of aerial tactics, situational awareness, and unflinching courage. The skies became a theatre of individual heroism and collective strategy. Reports of entire squadrons engaging dozens of enemy aircraft became commonplace. Radar-guided vectoring ensured that reinforcements arrived just in time, preventing bomber waves from reaching London or airfields. The interplay of technology, training, and bravery showcased the RAF's adaptability in the face of overwhelming odds. The human cost of these engagements was steep. Young pilots were killed, captured, or severely wounded, leaving gaps in squadrons that had to be filled almost immediately. Every aircraft lost meant a piece of the national defense removed from the battlefield, increasing the pressure on surviving pilots. Yet camaraderie and shared purpose tempered fear, creating bonds forged in extreme adversity. Commanders rotated squadrons strategically, ensuring that units retained cohesion despite losses. Each battle taught vital lessons, improving coordination and tactics for subsequent engagements. The psychological strain was immense, yet pilots persisted, often motivated by letters from family, patriotic duty, and belief in the justness of their cause. Civilians contributed indirectly, supporting efforts through civil defense, intelligence reporting, and morale campaigns. The intertwined network of aircrew, ground staff, radar operators, and civilians became the invisible scaffolding of fighter command. Together they created a system that could absorb loss while continuing to fight effectively. Britain's survival rested not just on machines but on the human will behind them. To say, by September 1940, the Battle of Britain reached a critical juncture. Hitler's shift in strategy from airfields to bombing London, intended to crush morale, inadvertently allowed fighter command to recover. Pilots replenished, tactics refined, and radar operators remained vigilant. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, suffered attrition that it could ill afford, with experienced crews lost and replacements inadequately trained. The RAF's combination of technological superiority, disciplined command, and extraordinary bravery began to turn the tide. Civilian fortitude amplified the effect, with every thwarted raid reinforcing the perception of invincibility. Air battles became more than tactical engagements. They became symbols of national resilience. Newspapers and broadcasts highlighted RAF successes, cultivating a sense of collective achievement. Pilots who survived were celebrated not merely as soldiers, but as embodiments of Britain's defiance. The psychological momentum shifted in favor of the defenders, altering the strategic calculus of the war. Ultimately, the RAF's finest hour was a confluence of planning, technology, skill, and human courage. The coordination between Dowding's radar network, Park's sector control, and the pilots in the sky created a seamless defense system. Fighter command absorbed blows, learned, adapted, and endured against a numerically superior foe. The few became icons, their stories immortalized in the annals of history. Civilians endured terror raids with stoicism, reinforcing the nation's resilience. Britain's survival was ensured not by sheer numbers alone, but by strategy, preparation, and unyielding will. The Luftwaffe failed to achieve air superiority, and with it, the prospect of Operation Sea Lion evaporated. September 1940 marked the turning point in the aerial struggle, proving that courage, technology, and leadership could defy overwhelming odds. The Battle of Britain had become more than a military campaign. It was a testament to the enduring human spirit in the face of tyranny. While the Luftwaffe sought to dominate the skies, Britain's survival relied heavily on another formidable force, the Royal Navy. Its sheer size, technological sophistication, and experience in amphibious defense presented a daunting obstacle to any invasion plan. Germany, in contrast, possessed minimal amphibious capability, having never conducted a large-scale seaborne assault against a well-defended coastline. Hitler and his generals had assumed that air superiority alone would be sufficient to neutralize the Royal Navy, underestimating the complexity of channeling troops across the English Channel under fire. British warships, from destroyers to cruisers, patrolled the Channel continuously, ready to intercept any attempted crossing. Mines and coastal artillery added layers of defensive depth, creating a near-impenetrable barrier. German planners lacked both ships and trained personnel for such an operation. Every transport, landing craft, and supply vessel would have been highly vulnerable to Royal Navy interdiction. The naval balance, therefore, was a decisive factor that weighed heavily against Operation Sea Lion. Britain's mastery of the seas rendered the German invasion plan perilously unrealistic from the outset. The Royal Navy's superiority was not merely numerical but qualitative, reflecting decades of maritime experience and industrial capacity. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers could bring overwhelming firepower against lightly defended transports. Radar and sonar technology allowed British ships to detect enemy vessels at long range, especially during night operations. Submarines patrolled approaches to key ports, ready to attack any German convoys attempting to cross the Channel. British naval commanders were skilled in coordinating fleet movements, maintaining communication with coastal batteries, and integrating intelligence from reconnaissance aircraft. Even with the Luftwaffe suppressing the skies, German transports would have been sitting ducks in the Channel. Amphibious operations required precise timing, coordination, and logistical support, all of which Germany lacked. Troops, supplies, and artillery would have to move simultaneously under heavy fire, a feat untested in modern warfare at this scale. The Royal Navy's presence turned the Channel into a lethal gauntlet, where German planners faced near-certain catastrophe. Every calculation for Operation Sea Lion had to contend with this naval reality. Deskings. Amphibious warfare is inherently complex, requiring specialized landing craft, coordination with air support, and extensive logistical planning. Germany in 1940 had almost no experience with large-scale seaborne invasions. The Kriegsmarine's focus had been primarily on submarines and commerce raiding, not transporting tens of thousands of soldiers across hostile waters. Existing vessels were either too slow, inadequately armed, or incapable of carrying sufficient troops and equipment. Germany attempted to improvise by converting river barges and small freighters for channel operations. These vessels were ill-suited for open water conditions, vulnerable to storms, and entirely defenseless against British naval attacks. The lack of trained amphibious engineers further complicated planning. Troops would need to disembark quickly under fire, construct improvised landing zones, and maintain cohesion, a logistical nightmare. The Royal Navy's readiness made such improvisation suicidal. Operation Sea Lion therefore faced an almost insurmountable maritime challenge before any boots touched British soil. The Channel itself was a formidable natural obstacle. Tides, currents, and unpredictable weather made precise timing essential for landing operations. German planners had little experience navigating these waters under combat conditions. Misjudgments in timing could strand troops on exposed beaches, leaving them vulnerable to naval gunfire and air attacks. British coastal defences, including minefields, anti-ship artillery, and observation posts, were calibrated to exploit these natural hazards. Even small vessels could be destroyed before reaching the shore, turning the landing into a catastrophic failure. Britain's intimate knowledge of its coastline gave the Royal Navy and coastal defences a strategic advantage. German intelligence underestimated these factors, believing sheer force could overcome them. Yet history demonstrated that geography and preparation could neutralize numerical superiority. The Channel was not just a body of water, it was a defensive weapon wielded masterfully by Britain. Born sail. The Kriegsmarine's limited fleet of destroyers and torpedo boats could not match the Royal Navy's scale or firepower. Any attempt to escort landing convoys would face overwhelming opposition. British cruisers and destroyers could strike from beyond visual range, aided by radar targeting. German vessels, slow and lightly armed, would be exposed to devastating bombardment. Losses in the Channel could cripple Germany's ability to sustain an invasion, even if initial landings were successful. Germany also lacked the specialized landing craft used by the Allies later in Normandy, which allowed for rapid and protected troop deployment. Troops forced to disembark from improvised vessels under fire would suffer massive casualties. Supply lines, already tenuous across the Channel, would collapse under naval interdiction. Every German calculation had to account for this naval dominance, yet planners repeatedly assumed British resistance could be overcome by air attacks alone. The gap between German ambition and maritime capability became painfully clear. Training and experience were equally decisive. British sailors had decades of practice in defending home waters, coordinating with air forces, and responding to enemy movements. German sailors had never conducted an invasion against a prepared adversary on such a scale. Naval exercises simulated many scenarios, but nothing could fully replicate the chaos of massed landings under fire. British coordination between coastal artillery, naval vessels, and the Royal Air Force created overlapping layers of defense. German planners could not anticipate every contingency, from mines to sudden air attacks to improvised coastal countermeasures. Logistics, maintenance, and communication, all vital for sustaining an invasion, were stretched to breaking point. Even minor delays could magnify losses exponentially. The Royal Navy's readiness transformed the English Channel into a crucible that would have tested any invader. Germany's lack of experience in amphibious warfare amplified the risk to near impossibility. Germany's overconfidence in the Luftwaffe compounded its naval shortcomings. Hitler and Goering assumed that air supremacy alone would neutralize the Royal Navy. Massive bombing raids, they believed, would sink ships, destroy ports, and paralyze Britain's coastal defenses. Yet the Luftwaffe could not maintain continuous pressure long enough to suppress naval forces completely. British anti-aircraft defenses, intelligence, and coordinated naval movements mitigated many attacks. Destroyers patrolled the Channel, cruiser squadrons threatened convoys, and submarines patrolled likely landing routes. Even if Germany achieved localized air dominance, the sheer expanse of the Channel made continuous coverage impossible. The interplay of sea and air forces demonstrated that control of one domain did not guarantee success in another. Britain's integrated defense of sky and sea rendered the German invasion plan highly improbable. The Secu. Ultimately, the Naval Equation sealed Operation Sea Lion's fate long before any invasion craft touched British shores. The Royal Navy's superiority, combined with coastal defences, amphibious expertise, and coordination with air support, made a successful German landing almost impossible. Even with partial air superiority, the Channel would remain a deadly obstacle. German planners faced a multifaceted challenge, from unpredictable weather to logistical shortfalls and inexperienced amphibious units. Every scenario highlighted the peril of attempting an invasion against Britain's maritime mastery. Hitler's gamble relied on assumptions that proved fundamentally flawed. The Kriegsmarine could not deliver troops, maintain supply lines, or protect vessels from British interdiction. The Royal Navy's dominance, coupled with Britain's home field advantage, transformed the English Channel into a natural fortress. Operation Sea Lion, ambitious in conception, faltered in execution. Britain's survival owed much to the men and ships that ruled its surrounding waters with unmatched skill and resolve. Through Sixpuri, Germany's ambitious plan to cross the English Channel relied on an improvisation that would define Operation Sea Lion, the conversion of river barges into invasion craft. These flat-bottomed vessels, originally designed for inland waterways, were ill-suited to the unpredictable tides, waves and weather of the Channel. Naval engineers worked feverishly to retrofit them, adding wooden decks, makeshift ramps, and minimal defensive armaments. Yet no amount of adaptation could address their fundamental limitations: slow speed, poor maneuverability, and vulnerability to the open sea. Crews were often undertrained, having little experience navigating these vessels in adverse conditions. Loading procedures were cumbersome, with troops and supplies crammed aboard in ways that made rapid disembarkation nearly impossible. German planners underestimated the dangers posed by even modest waves, which could swamp these craft. Every crossing required precise coordination, as any delay could expose vessels to devastating attack. The barge's flaws foreshadowed the many logistical nightmares that Operation Sea Lion would face. Britain's naval supremacy rendered these vessels sitting targets, amplifying their inherent inadequacies. The conversion process was rushed and haphazard, reflecting the urgency of Hitler's timetable. Barges were stripped, reinforced with planks, and fitted with ramps crudely bolted to the hull. Some received small-caliber machine guns for defensive purposes, though these offered minimal protection against artillery or naval fire. Troop compartments were cramped, and many soldiers were forced to sit in waterlogged holds, exposed to the elements. Mechanical failures were frequent, as engines were often underpowered or poorly maintained. Navigation equipment was rudimentary, relying on compass bearings and visual signals, inadequate for a large-scale invasion under threat. The German Navy conducted limited trials, which often revealed the vessel's inability to maintain formation in even moderate seas. Commanders were acutely aware of these risks, but pressed on under Hitler's insistence. The barges became symbols of both ambition and desperation, reflecting the gap between strategic vision and operational reality. In practice, their deployment would have been catastrophic under the eyes of Britain's defenders. The Channel's notorious tides compounded the barges' vulnerabilities. Unlike rivers, the coastal waters presented strong currents, shifting sandbanks, and sudden swells. Barges lacking a deep keel were easily destabilized, threatening to capsize under load. German planners attempted to mitigate this by anchoring and timing departures with high tide, yet even minor miscalculations could scatter the flotilla. Troops aboard faced seasickness, equipment damage, and exhaustion before even reaching the shore. Loading ramps, essential for disembarkation, were prone to jamming or being swept away. Ships in formation risked collisions, which could lead to panic and loss of cohesion. Channel weather was unpredictable, with sudden fog, rain, or gale-force winds, further complicating navigation. British coastal observation posts monitored these waters constantly, ready to alert the Royal Navy to any movement. The barge's shortcomings turned natural maritime hazards into lethal obstacles, rendering even a partial landing highly risky. Amphibious training for troops was minimal, reflecting the novelty of the operation. Soldiers were unfamiliar with the processes required to debark quickly from flat-bottomed vessels under fire. Disembarkation procedures were complex, requiring coordination between boat crews, landing officers, and infantry units. Any disruption, waves, gunfire, or mechanical failure could lead to mass confusion. Panic was a genuine threat, as troops crowded narrow ramps and decks. Equipment and artillery, crucial for establishing a beachhead, were difficult to unload efficiently. Engineers tasked with constructing makeshift defenses on the shore would face similar challenges. Coordination with air and naval support was untested, adding layers of uncertainty. In effect, the barges demanded a level of discipline and precision rarely achieved under combat stress. The inherent design flaws made them liabilities even before encountering British defences. The vulnerability of the barges to British attack was stark. Every vessel crossing the Channel would be exposed to Royal Navy ships, patrolling destroyers, and long-range artillery. Coastal artillery could target slow-moving barges, which lacked evasive capabilities. Fighter command could intercept convoys, exploiting the barge's sluggish maneuvering to inflict heavy casualties. Mines, pre-laid in strategic channels, presented another deadly hazard. Even a single lost barge could endanger surrounding vessels, creating chain reactions of collisions and panic. The minimal defensive armament on each craft was insufficient to repel any sustained attack. Troops aboard would be sitting ducks, vulnerable to gunfire and explosions alike. The cumulative effect of these vulnerabilities meant that any crossing, even with partial air superiority, would likely fail. Every barge became a potential death trap in the open channel. Hitler's insistence on a rapid crossing ignored these glaring operational realities. The scale of the barge flotilla also introduced logistical challenges. Hundreds of vessels were required to transport tens of thousands of soldiers, artillery, vehicles, and supplies simultaneously. Coordinating departures, maintaining formation, and synchronizing landings was a task of immense complexity. Limited docking and embarkation facilities slowed loading operations. Delays or mechanical failures in even a few vessels could disrupt the entire schedule. Communication between vessels was rudimentary, relying on visual signals and flags. Any disruption in signaling could cause collisions or dispersal of units. Supply chains across the Channel were tenuous at best, relying on untested procedures. Loss of even a fraction of the flotilla could cripple follow-on operations. These challenges were compounded by weather, enemy observation, and the stress of impending combat. The barge fleet, ambitious in design, exposed Germany's lack of operational preparedness. The psychological impact on German troops must also be considered. Soldiers crammed into small, unprotected barges faced exposure to wind, rain, and cold. Fear of capsizing, naval gunfire, or air attack created extreme stress even before reaching the shore. Troops had to maintain discipline while preparing for immediate combat upon landing. Any sign of disorder could cascade into panic, jeopardizing the entire operation. Commanders were acutely aware of these risks, but lacked alternatives. Training exercises provided minimal preparation for the chaos of an actual invasion. The barges, in effect, tested not only the material resilience of troops, but their mental fortitude. Many soldiers likely would have experienced disorientation, fatigue, and fear before confronting British defences. These human factors further highlighted the operational impracticality of the plan. The barges symbolized both Germany's ambition and the stark limits of its preparation. Ultimately, the barges represented a fatal flaw in Operation Sea Lion's design. Germany's inability to produce specialized landing craft, combined with the inherent deficiencies of converted river vessels, made any large-scale amphibious assault highly improbable. Channel conditions, logistical complexity, and lack of trained crews compounded the challenge. Every factor from tides to enemy patrols exposed the flotilla to catastrophic loss. Hitler's insistence on rapid execution ignored these operational realities, reflecting a strategic overreach. British mastery of the sea, coupled with coastal defences and naval experience, magnified the threat to the invasion craft. The barges, hastily converted and poorly tested, underscored the gap between ambition and capability. Operation Sea Lion's reliance on these vessels revealed the invasion's near impossibility. In the end, the Channel remained a formidable natural and man-made barrier. Germany's vision of conquering Britain across the water was doomed, foiled not by courage, but by the unforgiving naval equation. The Battle of Britain was not fought solely in the skies. It was equally waged in the shadows of espionage and intelligence. Germany's Abwehr, charged with gathering information on British defences, suffered from chronic inefficiency and infiltration by double agents. British intelligence, led by MI6 and MI5, skillfully manipulated German perceptions, planting misinformation and exploiting enemy assumptions. The double-cross system, known as the TIG system, turned captured German spies into instruments of deception, feeding Hitler false reports about troop movements, airfield strength, and defensive readiness. Through these channels, the British controlled the narrative of their vulnerability, presenting an illusion of weakness that Germany believed. German planners, confident in their intelligence apparatus, relied heavily on these reports to dictate strategy, unaware of the careful manipulations at play. Signals intelligence, including decrypted Enigma communications, provided Churchill's cabinet with unprecedented insight into Luftwaffe operations. Every German decision carried the risk of being guided by falsified information. Intelligence warfare, often invisible to the public eye, proved as decisive as any fighter pilot in the Battle of Britain. The careful orchestration of truth and deception created a battlefield that extended far beyond airfields and skies. To compensate, Germany's intelligence failures were compounded by internal contradictions and bureaucratic inefficiencies. The Abwehr suffered from infighting, overlapping responsibilities with the Sicherheitsdienst, and rigid adherence to outdated protocols. Field agents were poorly coordinated, operating without clear guidance or support. Many reports were based on assumptions rather than verifiable observation, and critical details were often lost in translation or misinterpreted by commanders. German planners overestimated the effectiveness of their espionage network, trusting information that appeared authoritative but was deliberately falsified. British deception operations amplified these errors, creating false patterns of troop movements, airfield vulnerabilities, and radar blind spots. The Luftwaffe's strategies, predicated on these flawed assessments, misaligned with reality. Every sortie risked targeting decoys rather than operational objectives. The interplay of German misjudgment and British cunning demonstrated that intelligence or its absence could reshape entire campaigns. The invisible chessboard of spies and double agents determined the allocation of resources, priorities, and ultimately the outcome of the battle. Double agents became the backbone of Britain's counterintelligence strategy. Captured German spies were turned under careful supervision, provided with incentives and threats to ensure loyalty. These agents, such as the infamous Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo, fed meticulously crafted disinformation back to Berlin. Each message was designed to reinforce false assumptions about British weakness, Luftwaffe airfield vulnerabilities, or impending evacuations. Germany, eager for confirmation of their plan's effectiveness, accepted these messages as authoritative. Garbo and others built elaborate networks of fictitious sub-agents, sending reports with convincing minutiae to make the deception believable. This orchestration created the illusion of intelligence corroboration, where multiple sources independently confirmed each other's fabricated information. The Germans, unaware of the manipulation, misallocated resources, directed attacks toward decoys, and underestimated British defensive capabilities. The XX system was not merely a spy network but a psychological weapon, turning German confidence into strategic misjudgment. In this shadow war, information became as lethal as any bomb or bullet. Like Combi, signals intelligence played an equally crucial role in shaping the battle's outcome. British cryptographers at Bletchley Park, including Alan Turing and his colleagues, decrypted Enigma-encrypted communications with unprecedented speed and accuracy. These decrypts provided near real-time insights into Luftwaffe operations, including bomber routes, fighter schedules, and target priorities. Churchill and his generals could anticipate enemy movements, reposition RAF squadrons, and optimize defensive deployments. The integration of human intelligence with signals intelligence created a feedback loop of strategic advantage. German commanders, unaware that their communications were compromised, planned raids and troop movements based on a false assumption of secrecy. British analysts, by contrast, could simulate enemy plans and devise countermeasures proactively. This intelligence edge allowed fighter command to concentrate resources where they were most needed, preserving both aircraft and pilots. The combination of deception, double agents, and code breaking rendered the Luftwaffe's superior numbers less effective. Knowledge, carefully curated and concealed, became a force multiplier in Britain's favour. WW2 deception operations extended beyond the intelligence community and into operational tactics. Dummy airfields, inflatable tanks, and simulated convoys misled German reconnaissance flights, drawing attacks away from genuine targets. Nighttime maneuvers and false radio transmissions reinforced these illusions, creating an artificial landscape that appeared strategically significant. The Luftwaffe, relying on reconnaissance photographs and intercepted signals, targeted these decoys, wasting ordnance and risking pilot lives on irrelevant objectives. By controlling both the physical and informational environment, Britain forced Germany to fight battles that did not exist. Each misdirected bombing raid not only spared critical infrastructure, but also drained enemy morale and resources. Psychological operations complemented these material deceptions, with propaganda broadcasts exaggerating British strength and resilience. The interplay of physical decoys and intelligence manipulation amplified the defensive advantage. German operational planning was consistently reactive rather than proactive, a result of being misled at every turn. Deception became a weapon of precision, striking at both strategy and psychology. The battle, therefore, was fought as much in the mind as in the air. German miscalculations were further intensified by bureaucratic rigidity. Field officers were often reluctant to question orders or intelligence, adhering to hierarchy even when evidence suggested otherwise. Hitler's obsession with central control meant that strategic decisions were delayed or distorted by layers of reporting. German commanders interpreted false intelligence as confirmation of their doctrinal assumptions, reinforcing flawed strategies. This rigidity created blind spots, leaving Luftwaffe formations vulnerable to RAF interception. Each erroneous calculation compounded the previous, producing a cascade of operational failures. Britain's intelligence services, conversely, thrived on adaptability and rapid analysis. Agents were empowered to act, information flowed efficiently, and decision-makers had access to both strategic and tactical insights. The contrast between flexible intelligence use and rigid German reliance on flawed reports became starkly apparent during key engagements. Operational success or failure increasingly depended on who controlled the truth. Germany's overconfidence in their information network blinded them to the realities of the battlefield. Defection B, the psychological dimension of espionage, also shaped the Luftwaffe's behavior. German pilots and commanders, believing in the accuracy of their intelligence, developed expectations of minimal resistance or ineffective opposition. These assumptions fostered overconfidence in attacks, reduced caution, and increased exposure to defensive countermeasures. Conversely, British pilots and ground crews, aware of the deception and informed by accurate intelligence, could anticipate enemy movements with precision. The resulting asymmetry magnified the effectiveness of smaller RAF squadrons against numerically superior forces. Germany's failure to interrogate and verify information led to operational missteps repeated across multiple raids. Double agents, cryptography, and reconnaissance decoys ensured that the Luftwaffe operated in a distorted reality. Every attack carried unintended consequences as pilots engaged decoys or misjudged RAF positions. The invisible battles of espionage directly translated into tangible outcomes in the skies above Britain. In effect, intelligence wars defined the framework within which air combat unfolded. Knowledge, manipulation, and deception determined victory as decisively as machine guns and Spitfires. By the culmination of the Battle of Britain, the supremacy of espionage and intelligence was undeniable. German operational decisions had been compromised at nearly every level, from strategic planning in Berlin to tactical execution over Kent and Sussex. British double agents, the XX system, and signals intelligence provided both foresight and control, shaping the battle in subtle yet decisive ways. The Luftwaffe's reliance on faulty intelligence amplified losses, misallocated resources, and prolonged engagements that could have been decisive. Conversely, Britain's adept integration of deception, counterintelligence, and code-breaking allowed fighter command to concentrate strength effectively, defend vital targets, and preserve the lives of pilots and civilians alike. The unseen battlefield of intelligence had directly contributed to the RAF's survival and success. In the shadows of espionage, the fate of nations was influenced as much by clever subterfuge as by courage and firepower. Hitler's misjudgment, British cunning, and the careful orchestration of deception together defined this critical chapter of the war. The Battle of Britain was as much a contest of minds as of machines, with espionage shaping the skies above and determining the course of history. The war in the shadows had become the decisive edge, invisible to many yet lethal in its consequences. In the summer of 1940, Britain's civilians lived under the constant shadow of an imminent German invasion, a psychological weight that shaped every aspect of daily life. Families clung to routines even as the government imposed strict blackout regulations to deny enemy bombers visual targeting. Streets and homes were shrouded in darkness each evening, with windows covered by heavy curtains and outdoor lighting extinguished. Citizens were instructed to carry gas masks at all times, a grim reminder of the potential horrors that could arrive from the skies. The evacuation of children, known as Operation Pied Piper, had sent millions to the countryside, leaving parents to navigate both pride and anguish. Daily life became a delicate balance between normality and vigilance, as every sound of aircraft overhead triggered tension. Civil defense committees organized neighborhood patrols and air raid drills, ensuring readiness at a moment's notice. Shopkeepers, factory workers, and office employees continued their work under the pall of uncertainty. Rationing was already in effect, influencing diet and household management. Across the nation, an undercurrent of anxiety defined existence, a quiet resilience emerging amidst fear. Blackout regulations transformed the visual landscape of cities and towns. Street lamps were dimmed or removed entirely, casting urban areas into a near-perpetual dusk. Vehicles displayed minimal lights, and reflective signage was covered or eliminated. This darkness was both a defensive necessity and a psychological strain, fostering disorientation and unease. Children, often evacuated, experienced separation anxiety while adjusting to rural homes or distant relatives. Those who remained in cities adapted to a life where ordinary tasks became hazardous in the dim glow of candles and lanterns. Neighborhoods organized watch groups, with volunteers scanning rooftops for enemy aircraft. Every window had to be carefully managed, every shadow accounted for, to prevent revealing targets. Civilian ingenuity became vital. Homemade shields, blackened lanterns, and clever camouflage mitigated some of the danger. The ever-present tension between survival and normalcy underscored the civilian experience during Britain's darkest days. Evacuation of children was both a logistical and emotional undertaking. Millions were transported from urban centres to the relative safety of the countryside, often on trains packed with emotion, luggage, and uncertainty. Parents faced the agonizing decision to send their children away, driven by fear but constrained by limited options. Schools coordinated with receiving towns to provide accommodations, education, and supervision. Children had to adapt rapidly to new households, sometimes with strangers, reshaping social bonds overnight. Letters and telegrams became lifelines, bridging the gap between fear and reassurance. The government meticulously tracked the evacuated populations to ensure welfare and safety. For those remaining in cities, air raid shelters, both public and private, became a central part of daily life. Families practiced rapid entry drills, understanding that minutes could determine survival. Civilian preparation became an art of constant vigilance, a network of practices aimed at reducing risk while preserving morale. The psychological toll on civilians was profound and multifaceted. The looming threat of German bombardment instilled fear in even the most stoic citizens. Children whispered anxiously at night, listening for aircraft engines, while adults balanced work obligations with readiness for air raids. Blackout restrictions created a perpetual sense of confinement, limiting evening social life and disrupting routines. Community organizations and churches provided support, offering both practical assistance and moral encouragement. Radio broadcasts, carefully managed by the Ministry of Information, delivered updates, warnings, and inspirational speeches, reinforcing unity and resilience. Anxiety coexisted with defiance, a blend of fear and determination that defined civilian spirit. Families improvised to maintain normalcy. Meals, entertainment, and education adapted to the constraints of wartime living. Neighbors became allies, sharing resources and information to enhance communal safety. In these daily struggles, Britain's population cultivated a quiet, enduring courage. Air raid drills were a central aspect of civilian preparation, blending discipline with survival. Citizens were instructed to proceed calmly to shelters, following designated routes and avoiding panic. Public shelters, often converted underground spaces or reinforced cellars, provided minimal comfort but maximal protection. Families maintained kits with essential items, blankets, food, water, and first aid supplies. The sound of air raid sirens prompted immediate action, signaling both threat and the necessity of composure. Drills were repeated regularly, reinforcing muscle memory and procedural understanding. Children participated in exercises, learning to respond instinctively to warnings. Observers documented compliance, ensuring the population adhered to prescribed protocols. These rehearsals emphasized both practicality and psychological readiness, embedding a culture of preparedness. The drills, though repetitive, instilled a disciplined response that would save countless lives during actual raids. Rationing and resource management shaped the civilian experience in tangible ways. Food, fuel, and clothing were distributed according to strict quotas, requiring careful planning and adaptation. Households relied on coupons to acquire essentials, balancing nutrition against scarcity. Meals became simpler, creative, and often communal, emphasizing conservation and solidarity. The government promoted home gardens, encouraging citizens to supplement rations with vegetables and fruits. Clothing and footwear were repaired meticulously, avoiding unnecessary waste. The civilian population's ingenuity extended to heating, cooking, and sanitation, with minimal resources stretched for maximum efficiency. Schools and workplaces adapted schedules and duties to conserve energy and maintain productivity. Despite constraints, the population maintained a sense of community, sharing surplus goods and supporting those in need. These measures, while restrictive, reinforced national resilience and underscored the collective effort required for survival. This day, the ever-present threat of invasion heightened civilian alertness and vigilance. Reports of reconnaissance flights or enemy naval activity circulated rapidly, sparking immediate responses from local defense units. Neighborhood watches coordinated with air raid wardens, monitoring streets and rooftops for suspicious activity. Citizens were trained to report bombings, fires, and suspicious behavior, contributing to a decentralized intelligence network. Communication networks, including telegraphs and telephone lines, ensured rapid dissemination of critical information. Families established contingency plans, from alternative shelter locations to evacuation routes. Public messaging reinforced readiness, emphasizing both caution and morale. Every citizen became part of a broader defense mechanism, integrating civilian action into national security. The fear of occupation coexisted with the determination to resist, shaping behavior and priorities daily. Britain's populace transformed ordinary life into a continuous exercise in vigilance and preparation. By the summer of 1940, Britain's civilian population embodied resilience under unprecedented pressure. Blackouts, evacuations, rationing, and drills collectively created a society adapted to constant threat. Emotional endurance became as critical as physical preparation, with morale sustaining daily life amid uncertainty. Community networks, governmental coordination, and adaptive strategies fostered unity and purpose. Citizens learned to navigate fear, transforming anxiety into structured action and practical planning. Their sacrifices and discipline formed a hidden backbone to the RAF struggle in the skies above. Every home, street, and shelter represented a microcosm of national defense, contributing to the broader effort against invasion. The interplay of fear, ingenuity, and determination defined civilian Britain, forging a society capable of enduring bombardment and uncertainty. In waiting for the blow, civilians had already proven their fortitude, creating the conditions for the eventual survival and success of the nation. Britain's home front, often overshadowed by aerial combat, was a silent battlefield of courage and preparation, whose contribution would be felt in every engagement above the island. By September 1940, the Luftwaffe faced unexpected resistance from the Royal Air Force, whose pilots, radar systems, and integrated defense network had blunted the German offensive over southern England. Initial attacks targeting airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories were met with fierce opposition, resulting in mounting German losses and operational frustration. Frustrated by their inability to achieve air superiority, Hitler and Goering opted to shift tactics, redirecting bombing efforts from military installations to urban centers. This strategic pivot became the infamous Blitz, targeting London and other major cities in an attempt to break civilian morale and force the British government into submission. Night after night, bomber streams rained destruction upon the capital, igniting fires that lit the sky in an apocalyptic glow. Industrial targets were still attacked, but civilian areas bore the brunt of the destruction, spreading chaos and fear. The Luftwaffe believed that sustained terror could demoralize the population, undermining resistance and compelling surrender. British authorities, however, had anticipated psychological warfare and worked to maintain morale through speeches, propaganda, and organized support networks. Fire brigades, rescue teams, and volunteer organizations mobilized immediately, attempting to mitigate the human and material cost of each raid. The shift in strategy, while bold, would produce unforeseen consequences for both sides. The Blitz represented a dramatic change in the conduct of aerial warfare, emphasizing psychological impact as much as physical destruction. London, Coventry, Liverpool, and other urban centers became the focal points of German attacks, with civilians forced into constant vigilance. Blackout regulations intensified, rendering the city streets nearly invisible at night and amplifying the sense of vulnerability. Air raid sirens echoed relentlessly, prompting repeated trips to shelters, underground stations, and improvised bunkers. Families prepared emergency supplies, stocked rations, and practiced rapid shelter drills, transforming homes into microcosms of civil defense. The psychological strain was compounded by the unpredictability of raids, with cities subjected to waves of bombs at irregular intervals. The Luftwaffe employed both high-explosive ordnance and incendiaries, aiming to overwhelm fire services and create widespread destruction. Smoke, fire, and rubble became familiar sights, altering the urban landscape dramatically. Despite these hardships, British morale remained remarkably resilient, with a spirit of defiance emerging among civilians and officials alike. The Blitz was not merely a military operation, it was an encounter between strategy, psychology, and human endurance. From the Luftwaffe perspective, the shift to civilian targets appeared logical. Military installations had proven difficult to neutralize, and German intelligence suggested that civilian panic could disrupt production and governance. Bomber formations flew at night to minimize losses from RAF fighters, relying on navigational skills, searchlights, and flak to reach their objectives. Crews were instructed to prioritize urban centers, identifying high-density areas as primary targets. Fires, explosions, and damaged infrastructure were intended to communicate the futility of resistance to the populace. German propaganda touted these raids as demonstrations of superiority and inevitability. Pilots, often young and inexperienced, faced the dual challenge of navigation over unfamiliar terrain and the increasing threat of anti-aircraft defenses. Mechanical failures, weather, and human error compounded the difficulty of sustained operations. Despite meticulous planning, the reality of civilian bombing campaigns proved unpredictable and chaotic. Ultimately, the Luftwaffe underestimated the British capacity for endurance, resilience, and rapid recovery. Civilian response was a critical factor in mitigating the intended impact of the Blitz. Authorities coordinated the distribution of shelters, ranging from reinforced underground stations to purpose-built public bunkers. Volunteer groups, such as the Air Raid Precautions, ARP wardens, and Firewatch teams, operated tirelessly, guiding residents to safety and providing immediate assistance after attacks. Medical services and emergency responders faced overwhelming challenges, treating burns, trauma, and injuries amid collapsing structures and raging fires. Families adapted daily routines to accommodate potential air raids, carrying emergency kits, and establishing meeting points in case of separation. Schools, workplaces, and public venues implemented contingency plans to protect children, employees, and citizens. Despite the destruction, morale campaigns emphasized national unity, resilience, and the inevitability of ultimate victory. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and government messaging reinforced a narrative of defiance, resilience, and civic responsibility. Communities banded together, forming networks of support that proved essential in survival and recovery. The civilian capacity to endure, adapt, and respond challenged the Luftwaffe's strategic assumptions and blunted the psychological effect intended by terror bombing. The material devastation of the Blitz was staggering, yet the human spirit remained largely unbroken. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, leaving thousands homeless, while fires consumed factories, warehouses, and infrastructure. Despite these losses, industrial output resumed quickly as workers improvised solutions, relocated operations, and repaired facilities under dangerous conditions. Citizens volunteered in reconstruction efforts, salvaging materials and clearing debris while maintaining vigilance against subsequent attacks. Firefighting units, often operating with minimal equipment, contended with conflagrations that spanned entire streets, relying on courage, endurance, and ingenuity. Medical services, overwhelmed but resolute, established field hospitals and triage centers to treat the wounded efficiently. The psychological endurance of the population, reinforced by leadership and community, countered the Luftwaffe's intent to instill fear and despair. Education continued where possible, with teachers and parents improvising lessons in shelters or temporary classrooms. Daily life, though disrupted, adapted to the rhythms of air raids, demonstrating the remarkable resilience of a society under siege. In this confrontation of terror and endurance, the Blitz became a testament to the British capacity to survive and persevere. The Luftwaffe's strategic errors became increasingly apparent as the Blitz continued. Intelligence misjudgments overestimated the psychological impact on civilians, assuming fear would translate into reduced productivity and weakened government resolve. Night navigation proved difficult, resulting in missed targets, unintended destruction, and occasional civilian casualties in neutral or friendly areas. Anti-aircraft defenses, searchlights, and RAF night fighters increasingly contested German bombers, compounding operational losses. Each raid incurred material, mechanical, and human costs that exceeded the strategic benefits achieved. Coordination with Luftwaffe intelligence was hindered by overconfidence and bureaucratic inefficiency, leaving pilots without timely updates or accurate maps. The German belief that sustained terror could break a nation underestimated cultural cohesion, national identity, and leadership. Civilian adaptation and government measures countered the intended effects of terror bombing. As casualties mounted, civilian solidarity and determination hardened rather than wavered. The strategic pivot, while initially bold, increasingly failed to achieve the desired outcome. The Blitz also catalyzed innovations in civil defense and urban resilience. Blackout practices became second nature, with families, businesses, and public institutions refining techniques to minimize exposure. Fire brigades developed rapid response protocols to tackle simultaneous conflagrations across multiple districts. Emergency communication networks ensured coordination between local authorities, medical teams, and volunteers. Community shelters evolved into organized hubs, providing sustenance, medical care, and psychological support. Citizens engaged in fire-watching shifts, monitoring rooftops and streets for sparks or incendiary devices. Volunteers, young and old, participated in clearing debris, rescuing trapped individuals, and maintaining morale. Public messaging reinforced a culture of preparedness, transforming fear into actionable vigilance. The cumulative effect of these measures mitigated the Luftwaffe's strategic intent while fostering societal cohesion. The Blitz became a crucible of innovation, endurance, and communal determination that would shape Britain's wartime identity. By late 1940, the Luftwaffe's shift in strategy had altered the trajectory of the conflict in profound ways. Although the Blitz inflicted widespread destruction, it failed to compel Britain to surrender or significantly disrupt military readiness. Industrial recovery, civic resilience, and unbroken morale demonstrated the miscalculations inherent in targeting civilian populations. RAF Fighter Command continued to operate effectively, undiminished by the terror campaigns. Churchill's speeches and propaganda reinforced a narrative of defiance and unity, bolstering both civilian and military resolve. The Blitz revealed the limits of psychological warfare and the critical importance of leadership, organization, and public cooperation. German operational focus on urban terror diverted resources from military targets, providing strategic reprieve for the British armed forces. In the crucible of bombing and destruction, Britain's civilian population proved remarkably adaptive, resilient, and courageous. The turn in strategy, intended to break a nation, instead strengthened it, highlighting the indomitable spirit of Britain. Ultimately, the Blitz became a defining moment, shaping not only the outcome of the Battle of Britain, but the identity of a nation under siege. WW2. As the Luftwaffe struggled to achieve dominance over Britain in late 1940, Hitler's attention began to waver, torn between the Western Front and the vast expanse of the Soviet Union to the east. In Berlin, the Führer's inner circle debated strategy, each officer presenting differing assessments of the war's trajectory and the priorities of the Reich. Hitler's characteristic indecision, tempered by ideological obsession, created friction within the military high command. Some generals advocated a relentless focus on Britain to secure Western Europe before turning east, emphasizing the necessity of air and naval superiority. Others argued for an immediate pivot to the Soviet Union, citing ideological imperatives and the perceived weakness of Stalin's forces. Hitler vacillated, oscillating between the two options, influenced by political advisors, personal convictions, and flawed intelligence reports. Military disagreements intensified as operational plans for invasion were drafted, delayed, and revised repeatedly. Resource allocation became a contentious issue, with divisions over aircraft production, naval readiness, and troop deployments exacerbating tensions. Each decision, or lack thereof, carried enormous consequences, shaping the potential outcomes of both Western and Eastern campaigns. The atmosphere in Berlin became one of anxious anticipation, as both allies and adversaries awaited Hitler's decisive direction. Hitler's shifting priorities toward the Soviet Union were informed by his long-standing ideological obsession with Lebensraum and the desire to crush Bolshevism. Military leaders attempted to reconcile these ambitions with the practical necessities of defeating Britain, stressing the importance of sustained air campaigns and potential amphibious operations. The German General Staff debated timelines, the readiness of the Wehrmacht, and the strategic risks of splitting focus between two major theaters of war. Hitler's impatience with perceived hesitation led to abrupt changes in orders, sometimes contradicting prior directives and creating confusion among commanders. Intelligence reports, often flawed or overstated, further complicated decision-making, suggesting both exaggerated Soviet weaknesses and persistent British vulnerabilities. Hitler personally scrutinized operational plans, intervening in technical details, from aircraft allocation to specific bombing targets. These interventions disrupted established command hierarchies and slowed the execution of broader strategy. The indecision in Berlin extended beyond the military sphere, influencing propaganda, diplomatic efforts, and domestic morale. Ambiguity in leadership created uncertainty among regional commanders, leaving them to interpret orders cautiously while anticipating potential reversals. The balance between Western conquest and Eastern obsession defined Hitler's hesitant approach during this critical phase of the war. Military disagreements within the Reich's High Command became increasingly visible as operational planning faltered. Field marshals, generals, and advisors argued over the feasibility of invading Britain versus preparing for a campaign in the East. The Luftwaffe demanded clarity in targeting priorities, while the Kriegsmarine expressed concerns about amphibious readiness and the persistent threat of the Royal Navy. Army commanders debated the distribution of panzer divisions and infantry regiments, concerned that premature commitment to one front could weaken capabilities on the other. Hitler's personal involvement, while intense, often exacerbated the situation, with orders changing abruptly and creating logistical bottlenecks. Political considerations, including relations with Italy and Japan, further complicated the chain of command. Advisors loyal to Hitler frequently reinforced his biases, presenting distorted intelligence or selective analyses that aligned with ideological imperatives. Morale among commanders fluctuated, oscillating between frustration at indecision and determination to execute imperfect plans. Operational readiness suffered as delays compounded, forcing planners to constantly revise strategies and reassess troop allocations. The result was a military hierarchy operating under strain, navigating uncertainty while attempting to anticipate Hitler's next directive. Hitler's indecision was mirrored by inconsistent operational directives to field units across Europe. Luftwaffe commanders received conflicting guidance on whether to concentrate on military targets in southern England or shift entirely to terror campaigns over civilian areas. Naval commanders faced similar uncertainty, unsure if resources should be committed to protecting invasion barges or diverted to the Atlantic to disrupt British supply lines. Army units stationed along the Channel coast hesitated to prepare for a landing that remained unconfirmed, balancing defensive preparations with reconnaissance and planning. Orders transmitted from Berlin often arrived late or were revised mid-implementation, creating logistical confusion and operational inefficiency. Personnel on the ground were forced to make judgment calls in the absence of clear instructions, further straining discipline and coordination. The indecision also impacted intelligence assessments, as contradictory directives confused priorities for reconnaissance, espionage, and resource deployment. Every delay allowed Britain to reinforce defences, repair damage, and improve early warning systems. In this environment, the initiative increasingly resided with British commanders who exploited German hesitation. Hitler's oscillation between campaigns had tangible consequences, eroding the effectiveness of an otherwise formidable military machine. Complicating matters further was Hitler's preoccupation with symbolic victories and ideological objectives. Strategic decisions were filtered through a lens of personal ambition, doctrinal rigidity, and obsession with demonstrating the inevitability of German supremacy. Military pragmatism often clashed with these ideological imperatives, creating tension between field experience and Berlin's strategic vision. Advisors attempting to ground plans in operational reality frequently found their counsel overridden or ignored. The emphasis on propaganda, image, and the perception of strength influenced directives more than objective assessments of capability or risk. Resource allocation reflected these priorities, with aircraft, munitions, and troops sometimes diverted toward objectives with symbolic rather than practical value. Political considerations, including maintaining cohesion within the Nazi hierarchy and signaling determination to allies and enemies, further influenced decision-making. The resultant strategic ambiguity left commanders to navigate uncertain orders while attempting to maintain operational effectiveness. Britain benefited indirectly from this indecision, gaining time to bolster defences, repair infrastructure, and reorganize air and naval forces. Hitler's fixation on both perception and ideology ultimately constrained his military flexibility at a moment of critical importance. Berlin became a hub of tension and debate as advisors, commanders, and ministers attempted to interpret the Führer's intentions. Meetings of the OKW Oberkommando der Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe command staff grew increasingly contentious, with disputes over timelines, force allocations, and priorities dominating discussions. Hitler's occasional outbursts underscored his impatience with dissent and reinforced a climate of caution among subordinates. Intelligence briefings were scrutinized for alignment with the Führer's preconceptions, often ignoring inconvenient truths about British resilience or operational constraints. Staff officers balanced careful planning with the necessity of rapid execution, trying to anticipate potential reversals in strategy. Confusion at the top filtered down through the command structure, creating uneven preparedness among units stationed along the channel. Administrative inefficiencies compounded operational delays, affecting supply chains, maintenance schedules, and troop readiness. In this atmosphere, even routine decisions carried disproportionate weight, as missteps could provoke severe reprimands or strategic setbacks. The indecision at the highest level underscored the fragility of centralized command, reliant on a single, unpredictable authority. Berlin's corridors, once bustling with confident directives, now echoed with uncertainty and debate. Hitler's attention increasingly turned eastward, contemplating the campaign against the Soviet Union, which he regarded as both ideologically essential and strategically decisive. Advisors warned that premature action could compromise ongoing operations against Britain, yet Hitler's obsession with Bolshevism and territorial expansion remained paramount. This dual focus fractured planning, forcing German forces to prepare simultaneously for two major theaters of war. Logistical challenges multiplied as resources were diverted to build stockpiles, reposition units, and ensure readiness for the Eastern offensive. Hitler's alternating emphasis on the West and East created confusion, eroding the coherence of invasion preparations and impacting morale across the military hierarchy. Officers in occupied territories monitored orders warily, balancing readiness with the anticipation of sudden changes in directives. The shifting focus also influenced propaganda campaigns, as public messaging oscillated between imminent victory in the West and ideological resolve against the East. Misalignment between strategy and operational capability became increasingly evident, highlighting the limits of centralized, personality-driven command. Hitler's hesitation, while reflective of broader ambitions, carried immediate and tangible consequences for the conduct of war. Britain's resilience benefited from this pause, gaining time to consolidate defenses and prepare for future attacks. Ultimately, Hitler's indecision in late 1940 shaped the trajectory of the Battle of Britain and the broader war. The lack of a decisive directive allowed British forces to recover, reorganize, and strengthen critical defensive positions. RAF Fighter Command and naval units capitalized on German hesitation, improving readiness and operational coordination. The Luftwaffe, deprived of sustained focus, encountered mounting losses without achieving air superiority. Political and military disagreements within the Reich underscored the limitations of a command structure overly reliant on a single individual's judgment. Strategic delay reinforced Britain's capacity to resist, demonstrating the unintended benefits of indecision in wartime leadership. Hitler's preoccupation with ideological objectives and symbolic victories constrained practical military flexibility at a crucial moment. The consequences of hesitation would ripple through subsequent campaigns, influencing decisions that shaped the course of World War II. In the interplay between ambition, obsession, and operational reality, the Battle of Britain emerged not only as a contest of planes and pilots, but as a triumph of resilience against the uncertainties of leadership. Berlin's indecision, paradoxically, became a pivotal factor in Britain's survival and eventual success. By September 1940, the German High Command faced the sobering reality that Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, could not proceed as intended. Initially conceived as a rapid amphibious assault following air superiority, the operation relied on a complex coordination of Luftwaffe, Kriegsmarine, and Army units. The Luftwaffe had failed to achieve decisive control of the skies over southern England, suffering sustained losses against the RAF's integrated defences, radar systems, and resilient pilots. Naval planners expressed grave concerns over the readiness of the Kriegsmarine, whose small invasion fleet faced the peril of the Royal Navy's overwhelming superiority. Sea and weather conditions in the English Channel further complicated any prospect of a safe crossing, with unpredictable tides, strong currents, and storm-prone conditions posing enormous risk to troop transports. Hitler's personal impatience and ideological obsession with Britain clashed with practical assessments provided by his generals, creating tension at the highest level. Intelligence reports emphasized both British resilience and the growing logistical challenges of coordinating multiple branches of the German military. Resource constraints, particularly the limited number of suitable landing craft and mechanized transport, added further complexity. Delays in preparing equipment, assembling troops, and training units for amphibious operations compounded the operational difficulties. Ultimately, strategic, logistical, and operational factors converged to make the planned invasion increasingly untenable. Tozo, the Luftwaffe's inability to suppress fighter command or destroy Britain's air infrastructure proved decisive in the postponement of Sea Lion. Spitfires and Hurricanes continued to challenge German bombers, inflicting unsustainable losses and denying the Luftwaffe the air superiority needed for a successful landing. Radar stations along the coast provided early warning of incoming raids, allowing RAF squadrons to intercept efficiently and minimize civilian and military casualties. The Blitz, while devastating to cities, did not cripple British industrial output or morale, leaving airfields, aircraft factories, and infrastructure largely intact. Night bombing raids, though psychologically impactful, could not substitute for the precise destruction of air defense networks essential to invasion plans. German pilots faced fatigue, equipment shortages, and increasing navigational difficulties, reducing operational efficiency. Commanders recognized that without air dominance, landing troops in the Channel would be suicidal. Even when favorable weather temporarily presented itself, the Luftwaffe lacked the capacity to ensure sustained suppression of RAF defenses. This failure underscored the interdependence of air and naval operations in amphibious warfare. The postponement of Sea Lion reflected the inability of Germany to reconcile ambitious objectives with operational realities. Naval considerations further reinforced the decision to delay the invasion. The Kriegsmarine, severely outnumbered by the Royal Navy, could not guarantee the safe transport of tens of thousands of troops across the Channel. German planners had converted river barges and small craft for troop movement, yet these vessels were slow, poorly armoured, and ill-suited for rough sea conditions. Any attempt at crossing would have left soldiers vulnerable to naval gunfire, mines, and submarine attacks. Coordination between naval and army units remained untested under realistic combat conditions, creating uncertainty about logistics, landing timings, and reinforcement schedules. High tides, shifting sandbanks, and storm-prone weather increased the risk of capsizing and loss of life. Supply lines would have been tenuous, and rapid retreat options limited in the event of resistance. German commanders repeatedly highlighted these vulnerabilities in briefings, yet Hitler's ideological drive for conquest complicated practical decision-making. Ultimately, the Navy's limitations, combined with the RAF's continued dominance, rendered the invasion plan operationally impossible at that time. The postponement marked a crucial strategic moment, allowing Britain to consolidate defences and demonstrate resilience. The army, too, faced daunting challenges in executing an amphibious assault on Britain. Panzer divisions and infantry units required specialized landing equipment, training, and synchronization to succeed. Logistical shortcomings, insufficient motorized transport, ammunition, and supplies threatened to turn the invasion into a catastrophic debacle. Troops remained underprepared for the complex coordination required to land on hostile beaches, navigate coastal obstacles, and establish footholds under enemy fire. Communications between army units, naval commanders, and Luftwaffe support remained unreliable, increasing the risk of confusion during critical phases. Reconnaissance was incomplete, with inaccurate maps and poor knowledge of coastal defences heightening uncertainty. German planners underestimated both the psychological resilience of British troops and the efficiency of emergency response mechanisms. Attempts to rehearse amphibious operations were limited by time, resources, and security concerns. The combined effect of these army deficiencies highlighted that Sea Lion was not merely a matter of political will, but of practical feasibility. Delay provided the Wehrmacht with time to re-evaluate and redeploy forces while avoiding a potentially disastrous confrontation. Weather played a pivotal role in postponing Sea Lion. The English Channel's natural variability posed unpredictable risks to landing operations. Storms, high winds, and tidal fluctuations threatened to scatter barges, disrupt troop landings, and compromise supplies. German meteorological forecasts were imprecise, and the timing of suitable conditions for invasion was narrow. Delays in weather windows required constant recalibration of invasion schedules, with no margin for error. Even brief storms could leave forces stranded at sea, vulnerable to attack from British naval units and coastal artillery. The combination of unfavorable weather and logistical complexity underscored the danger of attempting a rapid crossing. High seas would have rendered rudimentary landing craft ineffective and magnified casualties. Commanders feared that a failed landing could demoralize troops and embolden Britain. The postponement reflected a recognition that environmental factors could not be ignored in planning large-scale amphibious operations. Intelligence and reconnaissance further influenced the decision to delay the invasion. German planners struggled to acquire accurate information on coastal defences, troop deployments, and civilian readiness. The British had implemented extensive camouflage, decoys, and observation techniques, reducing the reliability of Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights. Double agents and deception campaigns contributed to misinformation, exaggerating German fears of countermeasures. Commanders lacked precise knowledge of minefields, beach obstacles, and artillery positions, increasing operational risk. Incomplete mapping of tidal flows, river estuaries, and sandbanks further complicated planning. Every intelligence gap translated into potential loss of life and mission failure during a landing attempt. Hitler's reliance on selective or overly optimistic reports exacerbated these issues. The confluence of flawed intelligence and operational uncertainty made postponement the most prudent course of action. Strategic patience allowed German planners to reassess the feasibility of invasion under more favorable conditions. Political considerations also played a subtle role in delaying Sea Lion. Hitler sought to maintain the appearance of confidence and inevitability, avoiding public acknowledgement of setbacks or operational vulnerability. Diplomatic relations with Italy, Japan, and neutral nations factored into timing and preparation, with Berlin attempting to project strength while masking internal uncertainty. Propaganda campaigns emphasized imminent victory, maintaining morale among German forces and citizens, while Britain remained unaware of the delay. Hitler's personal prestige was intertwined with the perception of operational capability, discouraging open acknowledgement of logistical and strategic challenges. Maintaining secrecy was critical to prevent British anticipation and counter-preparation. Even as advisors and commanders pressed for practical adjustments, Hitler's concern with perception limited flexibility. Postponement, framed internally as a strategic choice, allowed Germany to preserve credibility while buying time. The intersection of politics, ideology, and military reality defined the contours of this critical decision. Germany's inability to proceed decisively reflected both external constraints and internal mismanagement. Ultimately, the formal postponement of Operation Sea Lion in September 1940 marked a turning point in the early war against Britain. By delaying, Hitler inadvertently allowed the British to recover, reorganize, and reinforce critical defensive positions along the Channel coast. RAF Fighter Command, spurred by recent victories and bolstered defenses, gained operational breathing room to consolidate radar networks and improve interception capabilities. Naval units strengthened coastal patrols and amphibious countermeasures, further deterring potential landings. The postponement demonstrated the interdependence of air, naval, and land forces in large-scale invasions and highlighted the consequences of misaligned planning. Strategic patience, enforced by circumstance, preserved British morale and showcased the resilience of an island nation. Operational delays provided time for intelligence gathering, defensive fortifications, and civil preparedness, amplifying the cost of any future attempt. Hitler's initial ambitions collided with operational realities, underscoring the gap between ideology and practical warfare. The decision to postpone Sea Lion, whether intentional or forced, shaped the trajectory of World War II by preserving Britain as a critical base of resistance. In retrospect, the delay not only prevented a catastrophic German defeat, but also solidified Britain's role as a decisive player in the global conflict. The postponement of Operation Sea Lion has long fueled debates among military historians, inviting speculation about what might have occurred had Hitler pressed forward with the invasion in 1940. Contingency analysis begins with an assessment of Germany's military readiness at the time, including Luftwaffe capabilities, Kriegsmarine limitations, and the condition of the Wehrmacht's ground forces. The Luftwaffe had not achieved air superiority, leaving invasion forces vulnerable to RAF interception, bombing, and reconnaissance. Naval weaknesses compounded the problem, as the German invasion fleet was small, hastily converted from river barges, and untested in amphibious operations. Troops lacked specialized training for amphibious assaults and beachhead consolidation, while communications between air, land, and naval units remained precarious. Strategic planners argue that even under ideal circumstances, the Channel's unpredictable weather, tides, and currents would have created significant operational hazards. Intelligence gaps regarding British coastal defences and troop readiness further reduced the likelihood of rapid success. Any landing attempt would have faced immediate counterattack from both RAF and Royal Navy units, threatening catastrophic losses. In this counterfactual scenario, success hinged on unprecedented coordination, luck, and favorable environmental conditions. The debate underscores how close Germany came to a potential disaster merely by contemplating an amphibious invasion. Historians often examine the Luftwaffe's role as the critical variable in the invasion's potential outcome. German planners assumed that air superiority would neutralize RAF defenses and enable safe passage for transport barges and troop movements. However, the resilience of fighter command, combined with radar and early warning networks, made achieving complete dominance improbable. Losses among bomber and fighter units would have been severe, weakening support for the landing force and reducing operational flexibility. Even if air superiority were temporarily achieved, the RAF's ability to repair airfields, redeploy squadrons, and utilize night raids would have posed ongoing threats. German pilots were already stretched thin, and attrition from sustained campaigns would have undermined effectiveness. The Luftwaffe's inability to sustain consistent pressure over southern England meant that the invasion would have faced immediate air resistance. This factor alone could have turned any initial success into a rapid strategic failure. Historical models suggest that without air supremacy, amphibious operations of Sea Lion scale were unlikely to succeed. The counterfactual reveals the interdependence of air and naval dominance in shaping the fate of the invasion. Tumpete Endway Denk 5. The naval dimension of the hypothetical invasion further complicates analysis. The Kriegsmarine, constrained by numbers, technology, and operational experience, faced the formidable Royal Navy along the Channel coast. Converted river barges, flat-bottomed and fragile, would have been easily targeted by destroyers, cruisers, and coastal artillery. Storms or sudden high tides could have scattered troops and equipment, leaving them exposed to fire and forcing units to struggle ashore in chaotic conditions. Coordination between naval transports and landing troops was untested at the necessary scale, creating a high probability of delays and misalignment. Supply chains would have been tenuous, leaving landing forces at risk of isolation and attrition. Amphibious landings in Normandy during 1944 later demonstrated the complexity of orchestrating multi-branch operations, highlighting the enormous challenges Germany would have faced. The presence of British minefields and obstacles on beaches would have slowed the advance, allowing defenders to concentrate fire. Any significant disruption at sea would have amplified casualties and likely resulted in operational collapse. Naval historians argue that the logistical and tactical realities of the Channel made successful execution of Sea Lion exceedingly unlikely. The counterfactual emphasizes that naval inadequacy was as decisive as air dominance in determining feasibility. SETI ground forces posed additional uncertainties in the scenario. German infantry, panzer divisions, and mechanized units lacked experience in amphibious assaults and rapid consolidation of captured beachheads. Coordination between units landing at different points along the coast was limited, increasing the risk of fragmentation. Troops would have faced immediate resistance from well-prepared British forces, utilizing defensive emplacements, obstacles, and artillery. Morale among soldiers, while high, could have been tested by the chaos of stormy landings, heavy casualties, and disruption of command structures. Logistical delays in bringing forward ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements could have left units stranded in vulnerable positions. Even if initial objectives were met, sustaining momentum across multiple landing zones would have proved challenging. Counterattacks from reserve divisions and reinforcements positioned inland would have threatened flanks and lines of communication. Historical simulations indicate that many units may have been forced to retreat under pressure, incurring severe losses. The hypothetical scenario reveals that amphibious success would have required near-perfect execution against overwhelming odds. German ground forces, despite their effectiveness elsewhere, were ill prepared for such a complex operation in 1940. Environmental and geographic factors significantly shaped the counterfactual analysis. The English Channel, with its narrow but turbulent waters, unpredictable tides, and storm-prone climate, created inherent risks to invasion craft. Beaches were heavily defended and subject to flooding, minefields, and natural obstacles that impeded the rapid disembarkation of troops. Storm surges or rough seas could have capsized landing craft, disrupted formations, and delayed reinforcement schedules. Even favorable weather could not eliminate challenges posed by narrow landing zones and constrained maneuverability. Coastal reconnaissance by the Germans had been incomplete, leaving uncertainty about obstacles, defensive positions, and troop concentrations. British forces were adept at exploiting terrain, including marshes, hedgerows, and elevated positions, complicating the advance of mechanized units. These geographic realities imposed rigid limitations on timing, coordination, and speed of assault. Environmental hazards magnified the already substantial risks posed by air and naval opposition. The Channel itself became a decisive variable in counterfactual assessments, capable of transforming a tactical victory into strategic disaster. Planners recognized that the margin for error was negligible. Civilian and logistical considerations further influenced counterfactual outcomes. Britain had mobilized extensive civil defense measures, including evacuation plans, shelters, and emergency services capable of responding to air raids and invasion attempts. Railways, roads, and communication networks were organized to move troops and civilians efficiently, complicating German assumptions of a rapid collapse. Industrial production, dispersed across the country, remained capable of sustaining war efforts, providing reinforcements and equipment for extended resistance. Supplies for landing forces would have been vulnerable to interception or delay, reducing operational sustainability. Even minor delays in disembarkation could have created cascading failures across multiple units. British morale, strengthened by Churchill's leadership and propaganda, would likely have bolstered defensive resolve. The population's familiarity with air raids and civil defense procedures made surprise tactics less effective. Logistical failures, combined with resilient resistance, increased the likelihood of strategic failure. Counterfactual analysis underscores that the invasion's success was as much about societal resilience as military capability. Every factor, from civilian organization to industrial continuity, favored the defenders. Historians also explore the strategic consequences had Sea Lion succeeded. Even in a hypothetical victory, Germany would have faced prolonged resistance from British forces regrouping inland. Control of ports, airfields, and supply lines would have been contested, requiring continued air and naval support. Maintaining communications across the Channel and consolidating occupied territory would have strained German resources, potentially weakening other fronts. The psychological impact on Europe, while initially favorable to Germany, might have provoked intensified Allied countermeasures and reinforced resistance movements. Success could have altered diplomatic dynamics, drawing the United States' attention earlier, or changing Soviet perceptions of the Western Front. The invasion may have delayed or complicated future operations, including the eventual campaign against the Soviet Union. Conversely, failure would have precipitated catastrophic losses, potentially undermining morale across Germany and occupied territories. Strategically, the operation represented a high-risk gamble with potential for both immense gain and devastating loss. Counterfactuals highlight the delicate balance between ambition and operational reality in Hitler's planning. The postponed invasion preserved Britain's capacity to resist and shape the broader trajectory of the war. Ultimately, the counterfactual examination of Operation Sea Lion reveals the razor-thin margin between ambition and disaster. The combined influence of air, naval, and ground limitations created near insurmountable obstacles for a successful landing. Environmental unpredictability, intelligence gaps, and logistical challenges further compounded the risks. Britain's preparedness, societal resilience, and capacity for rapid response added another layer of complexity. Historical simulations consistently suggest that even under optimal conditions, Sea Lion faced low probabilities of success. The postponement allowed Britain to recover, strengthen defences, and endure the Luftwaffe's blitz with minimal disruption to operational capability. Hitler's ideological obsession collided with practical reality, demonstrating the perils of overreach in military planning. While historians continue to debate the nuances of what if, the prevailing consensus is that postponement spared Germany from a likely disaster. This chapter illuminates the interplay between strategy, environment, and human factors, showing how contingency, preparedness, and circumstance shape the course of World War II. The hypothetical invasion remains a cautionary tale of ambition constrained by reality. By the summer of 1940, as the Luftwaffe rained destruction across southern England and the threat of Operation Sea Lion loomed, Britain faced a perilous moment in its history. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, newly at the helm of the nation, recognized that leadership in such a crisis required both strategic vision and the ability to inspire a beleaguered population. He understood that the morale of civilians and military personnel alike was as critical as the physical defences along the Channel. Churchill's speeches, broadcast over radio waves, sought to reassure the nation while emphasizing the gravity of the moment, balancing truth with resolute optimism. He travelled within London, inspecting bombed districts, interacting with emergency services, and visibly demonstrating solidarity with the populace. Behind the scenes, Churchill coordinated with military advisors, ensuring that the RAF, Royal Navy, and Army units were aligned and prepared for multiple contingencies. His decisiveness contrasted with the uncertainty exhibited by some ministers and military officials, reinforcing confidence in government stability. Diplomatic correspondence with allies and neutral powers projected British resolve and deterred opportunistic maneuvers by Germany. Churchill's personal charisma, combined with his strategic foresight, created a sense of cohesion in a nation under existential threat. His leadership during this period would define Britain's ability to endure and ultimately resist the Axis onslaught. Churchill's speeches became iconic tools of psychological warfare, carefully crafted to bolster morale while intimidating potential aggressors. On July 10, 1940, he famously declared that Britain would never surrender, framing resistance as a moral imperative and a national duty. He emphasized collective effort, invoking images of cities, villages, and countryside united against a common enemy. Through radio broadcasts, he spoke directly to soldiers, airmen, and civilians, creating an intimate connection that transcended social class and geography. Churchill balanced reassurance with stark realism, acknowledging the sacrifices required while instilling a sense of purpose. The repetition of key themes, courage, resilience, and defiance, reinforced public determination even as bombs fell across the country. He also engaged with Parliament to ensure support for emergency measures, rationing, and civil defence programs. These speeches were not mere rhetoric. They provided psychological stability essential for sustaining operational effectiveness across military and civilian spheres. Churchill's eloquence amplified the collective will to resist, transforming fear into disciplined resolve. His leadership style combined oratory brilliance with practical administrative action, a duality critical for survival during this uncertain period. Strategic coordination was another pillar of Churchill's leadership during the crisis. He worked closely with Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding and his fighter command staff to allocate resources, prioritize defensive positions, and monitor enemy movements. The integration of radar networks, observation posts, and aircraft deployment plans reflected Churchill's insistence on leveraging technology alongside human expertise. He held regular meetings with senior officers to evaluate intelligence, adapt tactics, and anticipate Luftwaffe maneuvers. Simultaneously, Churchill maintained pressure on the Royal Navy to secure control of the Channel and prevent German infiltration or sabotage. His involvement was not micromanagement, but rather a strategic oversight, ensuring that inter-service cooperation functioned seamlessly. Decisions on aircraft production, pilot training, and maintenance schedules were influenced by his assessment of operational priorities. Churchill also coordinated with regional civil defense authorities, linking military planning with civilian protection strategies. This comprehensive approach ensured that Britain's defences remained resilient despite relentless bombardment. By intertwining military, political, and civil spheres, Churchill established a framework for national survival. His vision of integrated resistance became a model of crisis leadership under existential threat. Churchill's diplomacy complemented his domestic leadership, particularly in maintaining crucial alliances and deterring Axis opportunism. He corresponded with President Roosevelt, laying the groundwork for eventual American support, and ensured that Britain's plight remained visible on the global stage. Through careful messaging to neutral countries, Churchill sought to prevent them from aiding Germany or exploiting Britain's vulnerability. He utilized intelligence reports to shape diplomatic conversations, emphasizing Britain's resilience and the strategic risks Germany faced in prolonging aggression. Communication with dominions such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand reinforced the unity of the British Empire, mobilizing additional resources, manpower, and morale. Churchill recognized that international perception could influence Germany's calculations, and he leveraged every opportunity to signal Britain's determination. He skillfully balanced public optimism with behind-the-scenes strategic caution, ensuring allies were reassured while maintaining operational secrecy. These diplomatic maneuvers reinforced Britain's standing while constraining Hitler's decision-making. Churchill's awareness of the geopolitical chessboard allowed Britain to punch above its weight in a conflict with vastly superior enemy resources. His combination of rhetoric, strategy, and diplomacy exemplified the multidimensional demands of leadership in wartime. Churchill's personal courage and visible presence inspired confidence across all levels of society. Despite frequent air raids and the destruction of central London, he remained in the capital, inspecting damage, encouraging relief efforts, and engaging directly with citizens. He visited bombed neighborhoods, hospitals, and shelters, reinforcing solidarity with the civilian population. Soldiers and airmen drew strength from the knowledge that their Prime Minister shared the dangers and hardships of their daily reality. Churchill's commitment to remaining in London contrasted with leaders elsewhere who might have retreated to safer locales, sending a powerful signal of resolve. His visibility reinforced the message that resistance was both possible and morally imperative. Personal anecdotes of his interactions with frontline personnel and civilians circulated widely, amplifying his influence and reinforcing the ethos of shared sacrifice. These actions bridged the gap between government policy and popular experience, humanizing leadership in a time of crisis. Churchill's willingness to endure risk alongside his nation strengthened morale and legitimacy. His presence became a symbol that no adversity, however severe, could break Britain's collective spirit. Churchill's management of propaganda and public perception was equally critical during the crisis. He understood that sustaining morale required not only physical defense, but also the shaping of national consciousness. State-controlled media, under his direction, highlighted acts of heroism, resilience, and communal solidarity. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and posters emphasized the RAF's successes, the bravery of civilians, and the unity of the British Empire. At the same time, Churchill discouraged defeatist narratives and monitored public sentiment to counter potential panic. Propaganda was tightly interwoven with military strategy, ensuring that information reinforced operational priorities without revealing sensitive intelligence. This dual approach, informing and inspiring while maintaining operational security, was central to Britain's ability to endure sustained bombing campaigns. By controlling narrative and perception, Churchill transformed adversity into a tool for cohesion. His leadership extended beyond policy and strategy into the realm of psychological resilience. This approach ensured that even in moments of despair, the British population remained steadfast and committed. Churchill's leadership also emphasized adaptability in the face of shifting threats. As the Luftwaffe adjusted tactics, targeting civilian centers during the Blitz, Churchill recalibrated policy, resource allocation, and messaging. Emergency services received additional support, anti-aircraft defenses were reinforced, and evacuation procedures refined to minimize casualties. He liaised with regional governors to ensure efficient coordination between local authorities and military planners. Contingency plans for potential invasion scenarios were continuously updated, reflecting changing intelligence and battlefield realities. Churchill encouraged innovation in both military and civil spheres, fostering resilience through proactive preparation rather than reactive measures. His approach balanced strategic foresight with tactical flexibility, allowing Britain to respond effectively under pressure. By anticipating enemy actions and adapting policies rapidly, Churchill maintained a continuous operational advantage. The combination of foresight, decisiveness, and adaptability defined his tenure during Britain's darkest hours. Leadership, he demonstrated, required constant vigilance, responsiveness, and personal involvement. Ultimately, Churchill's leadership in 1940 ensured that Britain withstood the threat of invasion and the terror of the Blitz. His speeches, policies, diplomacy, and personal courage forged a resilient national ethos, linking government, military, and civilian spheres. The psychological, strategic, and operational measures he implemented created conditions under which the RAF could defend the skies, the Royal Navy could secure the Channel, and civilians could endure bombing with resilience. Churchill's ability to unify disparate elements of society under a shared purpose provided a model of leadership under existential threat. Even as Germany's plans faltered, his guidance ensured that Britain emerged not merely intact, but strengthened in morale, capability, and global standing. The interplay of vision, decisiveness, adaptability, and personal engagement exemplified the multifaceted demands of wartime leadership. Without his intervention, Britain's survival and the eventual Allied victory may have been compromised. Churchill's actions in crisis demonstrated the power of leadership to shape not only the immediate battlefield, but the course of history. His stewardship preserved Britain as a bastion of resistance, altering the trajectory of World War II. The legacy of his leadership continues to resonate as a testament to courage, strategy, and the human capacity to endure under extraordinary pressure. As Hitler contemplated Operation Sea Lion, propaganda became a pivotal tool in shaping perceptions on both sides of the English Channel. In Germany, posters, newspapers, and radio broadcasts glorified the anticipated invasion, portraying the operation as a decisive strike that would secure continental dominance. Illustrations depicted heroic Wehrmacht soldiers and unstoppable Luftwaffe waves, reinforcing the illusion of invincibility. Films produced by the Reich Ministry of Propaganda dramatized amphibious assaults, emphasizing discipline, efficiency, and the inevitability of victory. The regime emphasized ideological narratives, framing Britain as decadent and morally weak, unworthy of resistance. Propaganda posters adorned public spaces, showing invaders triumphantly disembarking, while British soldiers were caricatured as disorganized or cowardly. Youth organizations like the Hitler Youth were mobilized to disseminate this messaging, creating a culture of expectation and nationalistic fervor. German citizens were thus primed to view the invasion not as a gamble, but as a destined triumph. These campaigns bolstered public morale and reinforced commitment to the war effort. The pervasive visual and auditory reinforcement of Sea Lion's inevitability shaped the domestic perception of the impending conflict. To the sea. Conversely, British propaganda sought to counter these narratives, emphasizing vigilance, resilience, and unity. Posters, radio broadcasts, and pamphlets depicted the German threat, while reassuring citizens that preparation and courage could withstand invasion attempts. Iconography highlighted determined RAF pilots, steadfast Home Guard units, and an organized populace capable of enduring and repelling aggression. Slogans such as "Keep calm and carry on," and "Your courage will save Britain," became rallying cries that transformed anxiety into actionable resolve. Propaganda also aimed to expose German weaknesses, subtly undermining the image of invincibility cultivated by Berlin. Stories of heroic civilian responses to air raids reinforced a narrative of communal strength and defiance. Newspapers published accounts of Luftwaffe miscalculations, technical failures, and botched maneuvers, fostering skepticism about German planning. Broadcasts addressed regional audiences, offering guidance on air raid precautions and reinforcing the importance of unity. Even entertainment programs subtly incorporated themes of resistance, subtly conditioning the public against defeatism. This multifaceted approach created a pervasive sense that despite the looming threat, Britain remained capable of survival. Propaganda extended beyond public messaging into psychological warfare, targeting both enemy and neutral observers. German broadcasts, such as those transmitted via Radio Berlin, aimed to intimidate British listeners, exaggerating German strength and predicting imminent defeat. Conversely, the BBC's carefully monitored transmissions sought to inspire occupied Europe, demonstrating that Britain was resolute and capable of sustained resistance. Leaflets dropped over German-occupied territories highlighted Luftwaffe losses, logistical difficulties, and civilian suffering caused by the Nazi regime, eroding morale among both troops and citizens. These operations blurred the line between information and influence, transforming communication channels into active instruments of strategic warfare. Both sides understood that perception could shape behavior as much as battlefield outcomes. British propaganda was particularly adept at leveraging national pride, emphasizing history, culture, and shared values as reasons for defiance. Illustrations and broadcasts depicted ordinary citizens contributing to defense efforts, normalizing vigilance and perseverance. The interplay between fear, hope, and resolve became a battlefield of ideas, shaping attitudes and expectations long before physical confrontations occurred. The psychological dimension of Sea Lion proved as important as any tangible military preparation. In Germany, propaganda also sought to rationalize logistical challenges and operational delays. Despite production bottlenecks, limited amphibious experience, and Luftwaffe constraints, messaging conveyed an image of continuous preparation and eventual victory. Official communiques emphasized training exercises, model simulations, and hypothetical victories, creating an illusion of inevitability. Visual materials often depicted flawless coordination between air, sea, and land units, masking the uncertainty inherent in amphibious operations. The regime framed these depictions as demonstrations of technological and organizational superiority, reinforcing national pride. Youth-targeted messaging encouraged enthusiasm for the operation, with classroom exercises, illustrations, and films dramatizing the conquest of Britain. Even setbacks in exercises or maneuvers were spun as lessons being mastered, maintaining confidence among the public. Propaganda's emphasis on preparation and competence obscured fundamental operational risks. The contrast between projected invincibility and practical vulnerability highlights how narrative was manipulated to maintain morale. Ultimately, Sea Lion's propaganda became a carefully constructed fiction designed to inspire compliance and anticipation. ITES. British responses to German propaganda included both counter-narratives and amplification of domestic achievements. Radio addresses highlighted Luftwaffe failures, the resilience of fighter command, and the effectiveness of civil defense measures. Posters portrayed ordinary citizens, soldiers and airmen as heroic, framing collective effort as a moral imperative. Leaflets intended for German audiences emphasized misinformation about British readiness, suggesting overconfidence and tactical surprise. Public ceremonies, rallies, and speeches reinforced unity, creating visible evidence of a society prepared for total defense. Artists, cartoonists, and filmmakers contributed to messaging that blended humor, satire, and solemnity, undermining German intimidation efforts. Propaganda was tailored to diverse audiences, including women, children, and industrial workers, fostering widespread participation. The British press carefully curated stories to reinforce themes of courage and innovation, countering fear with concrete examples of success. This multifaceted approach ensured that psychological resilience complemented physical defense measures. By actively shaping perception, Britain neutralized part of the intended impact of German threats and prepared its population for continued endurance. Propaganda also influenced international perception, shaping the responses of neutral nations and potential allies. Germany sought to portray Britain as on the verge of collapse, aiming to discourage intervention or support from external powers. Meanwhile, British messaging emphasized resolve, highlighting the moral and strategic importance of resisting aggression. Reports of German setbacks and civilian bravery circulated widely, reinforcing Britain's image as a stalwart defender of freedom. This narrative helped secure sympathy, material support, and eventual strategic alliances. Diplomatic communications worked in tandem with public propaganda to present a coherent, persuasive portrayal of Britain's capacity to endure. International observers, from journalists to government officials, were targeted with curated information designed to emphasize Britain's strengths and Germany's vulnerabilities. The interplay of perception, messaging, and reality created a complex theater in which truth was intertwined with strategy. Success in shaping international attitudes reinforced Britain's negotiating position and deterrent posture. Propaganda thus became an essential instrument, not only for domestic morale, but for global strategic influence. Propaganda's visual dimension was particularly powerful in both countries. In Germany, posters, films, and photographs dramatized the precision, courage, and inevitability of the invasion. Illustrations depicted well-ordered troops, efficient logistics, and symbolic triumphs over caricatured British resistance. Conversely, British visual messaging highlighted heroism, endurance, and the ingenuity of ordinary citizens and military personnel. Aerial reconnaissance photographs, carefully selected, were used to illustrate enemy losses and British preparedness. Cartoons and caricatures conveyed satire, mocking German claims, while reinforcing domestic solidarity. Visual materials were widely disseminated in schools, workplaces, public spaces, and cultural centers, embedding narratives in the daily experience of citizens. Exhibitions and public displays showcased equipment, training exercises, and acts of heroism, making propaganda tangible. These images became enduring symbols of defiance or anticipated victory, shaping collective memory. The careful curation of visual content amplified the psychological impact of Sea Lion's narrative on both sides. Ultimately, the battle of images complemented the physical preparations for potential invasion. The phase is. The study of Sea Lion propaganda reveals the profound interplay between perception, ideology, and operational planning. Both German and British authorities recognized that the war of ideas could influence morale, civilian behavior, and even battlefield outcomes. Germany's portrayal of inevitable conquest contrasted sharply with Britain's emphasis on resilience, unity, and moral purpose. Propaganda affected recruitment, resource allocation, and public participation in civil defense, translating narratives into tangible actions. Psychological operations targeted not only citizens, but also enemy forces, shaping expectations and decision-making under uncertainty. Media, art, literature, and broadcast communications all contributed to the construction of a comprehensive narrative ecosystem. By blending fact, exaggeration, and selective imagery, both nations sought to control perception and, by extension, strategic outcomes. Sea Lion's legacy in propaganda underscores the importance of narrative in shaping conflict, demonstrating that battles are fought not only with weapons, but also with ideas. The careful orchestration of messaging, both overt and covert, illustrates how perception can amplify or mitigate the realities of military power. In this contest of information, Britain's resilience and Germany's overconfidence collided, shaping the historical trajectory of the conflict in ways that extended far beyond the battlefield. By late 1940, the German High Command began to shift focus eastward, as preparations for Operation Barbarossa increasingly dominated strategic planning. Hitler's obsession with the Soviet Union eclipsed the prospect of invading Britain, relegating Operation Sea Lion to a secondary concern. The Wehrmacht's attention turned to the vast expanses of Eastern Europe, with detailed studies of terrain, infrastructure, and logistics dominating staff meetings. German planners scrutinized rail networks, river crossings, and potential staging areas to support the largest invasion in history. Troop deployments were reorganized, emphasizing armored divisions and mechanized infantry suitable for the expansive Russian front. Supplies from fuel to artillery were stockpiled in anticipation of the campaign's unprecedented scale. Hitler's ideological fixation on Lebensraum and the destruction of Bolshevism infused operational planning with a sense of historical destiny. The Luftwaffe's priorities also shifted, emphasizing air superiority over the Soviet Union rather than Britain. Sea Lion, once considered imminent, became a distant contingency, overshadowed by the lure of rapid conquest in the East. The German public, largely unaware of this strategic pivot, continued to be fed imagery of ultimate victory in both theaters. Barbarossa's preparation drew vast resources away from the Western Front, directly affecting the feasibility of Sea Lion. Ships earmarked for potential channel crossings were redirected to support supply chains in Eastern Europe. Pilots, artillery crews, and infantry units were reassigned to build the forces needed for the Soviet campaign. Intelligence operations focused on the vastness of Russia, evaluating the Red Army's strength, defensive lines, and industrial centers. The scale of the planned operation dwarfed anything considered for Britain, emphasizing blitzkrieg tactics over amphibious assaults. Logistic officers wrestled with the challenges of feeding and supplying over 3 million men across inhospitable terrain. Fuel depots, armored support, and railway upgrades consumed time, attention, and manpower that might have been devoted to the Channel. The Luftwaffe began specialized training for long-range operations and close air support suited for the open Eastern Front. Propaganda shifted subtly, preparing German citizens for an Eastern Crusade, framing it as both ideologically necessary and militarily decisive. Sea Lion, once the centerpiece of Hitler's vision, now lingered as an unrealized ambition in the background of history. So, Hitler's personal obsession with the Soviet Union dictated the tempo of military planning, often overriding the advice of his generals. He perceived Britain as a diminishing threat, believing that sustained air campaigns and the Royal Navy's presence limited the feasibility of an invasion. Meetings with the OKW and OKH increasingly revolved around the timing, objectives, and phasing of Barbarossa. Scouting parties, cartographers, and intelligence operatives scoured Eastern Europe and Western Russia to anticipate operational challenges. Training exercises for divisions were adapted to simulate river crossings, forested regions, and winter conditions far from the Channel's sandy beaches. Mechanized units practiced rapid encirclement maneuvers, reflecting lessons learned in Poland and France. Political officers emphasized the ideological stakes, ensuring that troops understood the envisioned annihilation of Bolshevik forces. Hitler's insistence on strict deadlines forced planners to prioritize eastward campaigns, compressing the window for potential Western operations. Meanwhile, the British Isles remained unconquered, defended by a combination of geography, radar, and the resilience of the RAF. Sea Lion's postponement became not just a matter of logistics, but a reflection of Hitler's strategic and ideological obsession with the East. Postponed. The Wehrmacht's logistical apparatus faced immense challenges as attention pivoted to Barbarossa. Rail networks were upgraded to facilitate rapid movement of troops and supplies, often requiring months of construction and coordination. Fuel and ammunition depots were stockpiled along anticipated invasion routes, while winter provisions were prepared to prevent catastrophic losses. Artillery, tanks, and mechanized units were concentrated in staging areas, demanding precision planning to avoid congestion and delays. Engineers constructed pontoon bridges, river crossings, and temporary airfields, anticipating the needs of a campaign stretching thousands of kilometers. Supply chains were tested with mock exercises, revealing weaknesses that required urgent correction. Communications infrastructure, including field telephones and signal networks, was expanded to maintain coordination across massive formations. The scale of these preparations was staggering, dwarfing anything that had been required for an amphibious assault on Britain. Sea Lion's projected logistics, by contrast, now appeared modest and easily overshadowed by the Eastern enterprise. This shift in focus ensured that Britain's immediate threat of invasion diminished in Hitler's calculations. The Luftwaffe's strategic realignment further signaled the eclipse of Sea Lion. Fighter squadrons, previously stationed for Channel dominance, were reassigned to support Eastern campaigns. Bomber wings were retrained for deep strike missions against Soviet industrial centers and troop concentrations. Long-range reconnaissance aircraft were deployed to map terrain, assess fortifications, and identify logistical choke points. Pilots and crews underwent specialized training for extended sorties, adverse weather conditions, and rapid redeployment across vast distances. Air support doctrines were revised to integrate close air support with mechanized armored spearheads, reflecting the unique requirements of Barbarossa. The Luftwaffe's shift-deprived Sea Lion of essential aerial assets, making any channel invasion increasingly impractical. Germany's propaganda machine began subtly emphasizing the Eastern Crusade as a defining moment in world history. The narrative of imminent conquest of Britain receded in favor of highlighting preparation for the Soviet campaign. Operational priorities, training, and resource allocation thus converged to make Barbarossa the preeminent focus. German intelligence increasingly prioritized Soviet targets over British defenses. Reconnaissance missions, intercepted communications, and espionage networks were concentrated on cities, supply depots, and Red Army positions. Analysts studied winter conditions, river obstacles, and terrain features to ensure rapid troop movements. While British radar networks, coastal defenses, and naval assets were still monitored, they received markedly less attention. Hitler's fixation on ideological and territorial objectives in the East dictated intelligence priorities, sidelining the Channel threat. Maps, aerial photographs, and intercepted communications fed into detailed invasion plans designed for speed and total encirclement. Lessons from previous campaigns in Poland and France were adapted to the anticipated scale of the Soviet front. The diminished focus on Britain reflected both overconfidence and strategic necessity, as Germany could not simultaneously commit fully to two theatres. Sea Lion lingered as a theoretical operation, overshadowed by a campaign that promised immense territorial gain and ideological fulfillment. The intelligence apparatus, by redirecting attention eastward, solidified the marginalization of the British invasion. Strategically, the Shadow of Barbarossa fundamentally altered German military planning. Resources, personnel, and time were redirected toward achieving surprise and rapid victory in the east. Amphibious training exercises, previously central to Sea Lion, were deprioritized or cancelled entirely. Engineers, logisticians, and commanders focused on river crossings, supply chain efficiency, and coordination of massive armored formations. War games and staff exercises increasingly simulated battles across the vast plains and forests of the Soviet Union. The perceived opportunity for conquest in Russia created both urgency and risk, demanding meticulous planning and rigorous preparation. Sea Lion's potential was reduced to a contingency rather than a primary objective, as Hitler judged Britain contained by geography, the RAF and the Royal Navy. The reallocation of high-ranking officers and staff reflected this new priority, with key planners redeployed to eastern commands. Strategic momentum shifted decisively, with Britain remaining unconquered but increasingly irrelevant in Hitler's operational calculus. Barbarossa's looming execution dictated the pace, scale, and ambition of the German war machine. Ultimately, the Shadow of Barbarossa ensured that Operation Sea Lion would remain unrealized. Hitler's obsession with the Soviet Union, combined with logistical realities, Luftwaffe priorities, and intelligence allocation, marginalized the Channel invasion. Britain, while still defended by a resilient population and capable military, became a secondary concern in German strategic planning. The resources, attention, and ideological energy dedicated to the East eclipsed any practical preparation for amphibious assault. Sea Lion's postponement was both a reflection of prudence and a consequence of overreach, highlighting the competing demands of Hitler's ambitions. The focus on Barbarossa, with its promise of Lebensraum and ideological conquest, defined Germany's strategic trajectory for 1941. This redirection shaped the course of the war, ensuring that Britain survived as a bastion of resistance while Germany embarked on a perilous campaign against the Soviet Union. The Shadow of Barbarossa casts a historical lens on Sea Lion, revealing how ambition, ideology, and logistical complexity can determine the fate of entire operations. It remains a stark illustration of how strategic priorities evolve, often leaving even seemingly imminent plans unrealized. In the end, Hitler's eastward fixation sealed the Channel invasion's fate and reshaped the trajectory of World War II. Operation Sea Lion, though never executed, cast a long shadow over the trajectory of World War II, influencing both Allied and Axis strategic calculations. Hitler's unfulfilled ambition highlighted the limits of German logistical planning, revealing that even a nation at the height of its military dominance faced constraints when attempting amphibious operations against a well-defended island. The survival of Britain, against the backdrop of continental collapse, provided a psychological and strategic anchor for the Allies, enabling future operations from a secure base. Churchill's leadership, RAF resilience, and Royal Navy preparedness all contributed to a defense that transcended tactical victories, shaping global perceptions of resistance and morale. Sea Lion's cancellation allowed Britain to continue as a staging ground for intelligence operations, espionage, and preparations for eventual counteroffensives on the European continent. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. Hitler's overconfidence was checked, while British citizens internalized the value of perseverance under existential threat. Lessons learned from planning Sea Lion informed future amphibious strategies, including D-Day, as planners studied what went wrong and what logistical challenges had been underestimated. The unexecuted invasion became a case study in military prudence, risk management, and the consequences of strategic misjudgment. Historians frequently point to Sea Lion as a pivotal what-if scenario, shaping debates about how different the war might have been had Germany succeeded in 1940. Its legacy is a complex mixture of cautionary tale, national triumph, and enduring historical fascination. Strategically, the cancelled invasion underscored the importance of geography and preparation in military planning. The English Channel, a formidable natural barrier, combined with Britain's integrated air and naval defences, made a successful landing extraordinarily difficult. Hitler's engineers and planners underestimated the logistical challenges of coordinating thousands of troops, armoured vehicles, and supply vessels across unpredictable seas. Britain's coastal fortifications, pillboxes, and minefields further enhanced the island's defensive advantage, proving that physical terrain and civilian military coordination could decisively shape outcomes. The RAF's control of the skies, despite initial numerical inferiority, demonstrated how technological integration, intelligence, and strategic doctrine could offset overwhelming enemy resources. Sea Lion's feasibility was further compromised by the German military's lack of amphibious experience, an operational blind spot that would have led to catastrophic losses. By contrast, Britain's preparations and rapid adaptation underscored the synergy between leadership, morale, and infrastructure. The interplay between environmental factors, tactical planning, and strategic ambition became central to the historical assessment of Sea Lion. This legacy informed not only contemporary military thinking, but also the broader understanding of the interaction between geography and warfare. In every respect, Britain's survival was a testament to the combined weight of preparation, innovation, and sheer resilience. On the human level, the cancellation of Sea Lion preserved countless lives, both civilian and military. Had the invasion been attempted, historians estimate the cost in human life would have been catastrophic, with tens of thousands of Allied and German casualties likely on the beaches and in the air. British civilians endured bombing raids and rationing, but the island avoided the trauma of ground occupation and mass slaughter. For the German military, sea lion would have represented a high-risk endeavour, potentially weakening their Eastern Front ambitions by diverting troops, aircraft and resources to an uncertain Western theatre. The preservation of Britain allowed the Allies to maintain a coherent command structure, plan future offensives, and provide support to occupied European nations. Morale among the British population, bolstered by a shared sense of defiance, contributed to the long-term cohesion of national resistance. Allied propaganda capitalized on sea lion's non-occurrence, framing Britain as unassailable and the Luftwaffe's failure as proof of German vulnerability. The psychological dimension, combined with tangible military readiness, reinforced Britain's global standing. In this way, sea lion's legacy was not only strategic but deeply human, shaping the wartime experience and collective memory of survival. Its cancellation became emblematic of how human courage and institutional preparation could alter the course of history. Politically, sea lion's non-execution elevated Britain's diplomatic and symbolic importance on the world stage. Churchill's speeches and radio addresses, including the famous "We Shall Never Surrender" declaration, projected strength and resolve that resonated far beyond the British Isles. Allied nations drew inspiration from Britain's survival, solidifying coalitions and motivating contributions of men, material, and resources from North America and the Commonwealth. Sea lion's cancellation also forced Germany to reconsider its strategic priorities, delaying focus on other theatres, and inadvertently providing the Allies with critical time to regroup. The Soviet Union, observing Hitler's shift eastward, could prepare for Operation Barbarossa without the added complication of a fully executed Channel invasion. Sea lion, though unrealized, influenced diplomatic calculations, shaping alliances, negotiations, and the broader geopolitical landscape. Historians often highlight the symbolic power of Britain's resilience, noting how the mere threat of invasion mobilized international support and enhanced morale across occupied Europe. The campaign against Britain, even without a landing, became a defining episode in the global understanding of resistance and total war. Sea lion's absence thus paradoxically magnified its historical impact, reinforcing the lesson that threat and preparation alone can influence outcomes. The political legacy endured long after the war, shaping post-war narratives of courage, strategy, and survival. From a military historical perspective, Operation Sea Lion offers an enduring study in the interplay of ambition, logistics, and overreach. German planners envisioned rapid conquest, yet their understanding of amphibious warfare was rudimentary, highlighting the gulf between theory and practice. The Luftwaffe, tasked with achieving air superiority, faced unforeseen challenges, including radar integration, pilot fatigue, and coordination across multiple fronts. Supply chains, staging areas, and naval coordination presented obstacles that would have likely resulted in failure. By contrast, Britain's RAF and Royal Navy demonstrated the effectiveness of well-integrated defence, intelligence, and training. Sea Lion's postponement illustrated the consequences of overambitious operational planning without realistic logistical support. Military academies continue to study Sea Lion as a cautionary example, emphasizing preparation, terrain, and the balance of force. Lessons learned influenced Allied amphibious strategy, informing future operations in North Africa, Italy, and Normandy. Even as a hypothetical, Sea Lion shaped the evolution of military doctrine and operational planning in the 20th century. Its legacy is a permanent reminder that strategic ambition must always be tempered by practical constraints. Culturally, the legacy of a cancelled invasion became embedded in Britain's national identity. Art, literature, and cinema portrayed the imagined horrors of invasion, and the heroism of those who resisted. Children's books, novels, and wartime propaganda celebrated resilience, courage, and ingenuity, reinforcing collective memory. Monuments and museums preserved artifacts, aircraft, and personal accounts, ensuring that Sea Lion's potential impact remained visible for generations. Oral histories captured the perspectives of civilians who endured air raids but never faced occupation, providing unique insights into the psychological dimension of survival. The narrative of a nation standing alone, yet defiant, became central to Britain's cultural self-image. Media depictions, from newsreels to radio broadcasts, reinforced this perception, emphasizing unity and determination. Sea Lion's cancellation allowed culture to memorialize not just victory, but the avoided catastrophe, creating a dual legacy of triumph and near tragedy. Historians and cultural analysts alike recognize how this imagined threat shaped Britain's identity, valorizing resilience over conquest. The cancelled invasion thus lives on in collective memory, a symbol of courage and fortitude. On a global scale, Sea Lion's non-execution had profound implications for the course of World War II. The preservation of Britain provided the Allies with a secure base for intelligence, planning, and eventual counteroffensives on the continent. North American and Commonwealth support, facilitated through British infrastructure, directly contributed to later successes in Africa, Italy, and Normandy. German failure to neutralize Britain ensured continued disruption of shipping, espionage, and communication lines, hampering Axis operations. The strategic timeline of the war shifted, as Hitler's resources became increasingly tied to the Soviet front, while Britain and its allies expanded operational capacity. Sea Lion's absence indirectly prolonged German engagement in multiple theaters, contributing to overstretch and eventual defeat. Allied strategic planning benefited immensely from the secure survival of Britain, which remained a bastion of coordination, morale, and production. The hypothetical failure of Sea Lion thus reinforced the intertwined nature of strategy, geography, and timing in global conflict. Its legacy demonstrates that unrealized operations can wield influence equal to executed ones, shaping campaigns, alliances, and outcomes. Sea Lion remains a pivotal what-if that continues to captivate historians and military scholars alike. Ultimately, the legacy of Operation Sea Lion lies in its demonstration of restraint, risk, and historical consequence. Though never realized, it altered the strategic calculus of Hitler, informed Allied planning, and preserved a nation pivotal to the eventual defeat of the Axis. The operation's cancellation preserved lives, maintained morale, and allowed Britain to survive as both a symbol and a practical center of resistance. Lessons from Sea Lion permeate military, political, and cultural domains, emphasizing the importance of preparation, geography, logistics, and leadership. Its enduring fascination stems from the intersection of ambition, contingency, and human decision-making, showing how unexecuted plans can reverberate through history. Britain's survival became a beacon for oppressed nations, a rallying point for the Allies, and a testament to the power of determination against overwhelming odds. Sea Lion's shadow continues to shape historical discourse, providing cautionary lessons on the limits of strategy and the unforeseen consequences of prioritization. The legacy is simultaneously practical and symbolic, illustrating that sometimes the avoidance of action can be as decisive as its execution. In the annals of World War II, Sea Lion endures not as a battle fought, but as a testament to foresight, resilience, and the enduring impact of strategic choice.